Okay, it says we're live, so people in the chat can just like verify, can hear us clearly and so forth, but I'm just assuming that we are. So welcome everyone to this debate dialogue. This is a continuation of the two-part debate we had just over a year ago on whether the Book of Mormon and other restorationist scriptures and other texts like the 1832 First Vision account teach modalism or not. This is a continuation. We will be discussing whether the Greek New Testament teaches modalism. So this is going to be a fun debate. We're joined, as always, by my friend Adam Stokes. So Adam, how about you just like give an introduction to your good self before we kind of start the debate?
Absolutely. Great to be back, Robert. Always good to see you, man. So I'm just a mutt. I'm all over the place. So I am a librarian and I'm also a classicist. So I have degrees in religion from Duke University and Yale Divinity School. My background is in ecclesiastical Greek and Latin. I think I know when we're talking about the Book of Job, I think I mentioned to you I was doing a PhD for a while that kind of fell through, but I retained all the languages. So I'm a very big lover of Hebrew, ancient Greek, and ecclesiastical Latin. So I teach Latin at the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, and I'm a local librarian at the library here in Beverly, New Jersey. So those are my two things. I also have a great love for anything in the LDS or Mormon tradition. I prefer to say LDS because I know the church likes to say LDS. I'm actually not part of the Utah Church. I'm a part of a smaller denomination, the Church of Jesus Christ with the Elijah Message. And we accept the Book of Mormon, the Book of Commandments, and another scripture called the Word of the Lord, which we believe contains revelations by John the Baptist. But I love anything having to do with restoration history, restoration theology, and I've written articles and reviews for the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, Interpreter, which is one of my favorite journals, Element, and BYU Quarterly. So talking about anything related to theology, Christian theology in general, and restoration theology specifically is right up my alley. I One of the reasons for this particular podcast, as with the podcasts in the past, is that my church denomination accepts a modalist view of God. And I'll talk some more about that later.
And also Dan Vogel won't debate me on this topic, so we kind of go with someone better. But Adam's been on the podcast a number of times, so like we've debated before, but it's always been friendly debates. Does there be no
Yes.
moderate here? But he's also appeared like because he's done very good work in say race and the scriptures, very good essay in Moses 7, which is how I found out about you. We became Facebook friends. It's like, oh, he's in this very small group. Maybe I should get him to like give a podcast introducing the group and stuff like that. So that got the ball rolling. Most recently, you were on discussing your doctoral work on the Book of Job, which is pretty interesting. It's one of the most underestimated books because most people only read, like, say, the first two chapters and the final chapter, and not really pay attention to what's in between.
Yeah.
So no, that's fun. And hopefully and hopefully we'll have you on. By the way, for those who are wondering, we are hoping to do like another debate dialogue later this year on the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint. It's the team LXX, and whether he's strictly Unitarian monotheistic or not. So that'll be fun because that's one of the undergirding issues of modalism as well, like a Unitarian monotheism, not something monotheism simpliciter. But we'll be addressing that like maybe later in the calendar year, and hopefully when I'm back in the States. So until then, and for those who are maybe tuning in for the first time, my name's Robert Bollin. I used to work at the B.H. Roberts Foundation because they put my profile online. I think I can actually mention I work for a similar organization, but I'm just not going to name it at the moment. But people know which organization I now work with, and run the blog Scriptural Mormonism and the podcast as well of that name. So, but I think if you tune into this, you already know my background. And I have degrees in anthropology, theology, and I minored in biblical languages. But my pronunciation would be dreadful, so I do apologize in advance, Adam. They just tell us how to read it, not to pronounce it. So.
My Greek pronunciation, I remember my advisor used to say, yeah, you got to practice that. He bought me a CD to practice my Greek pronunciation. So it's going to be fun today as when we get in the Greek New Testament.
Yeah, no, that'll be fun. Okay, so what the structure of the debate is similar like the previous two. Like, we'll have like say I have three texts / issues I'd like to address, and Adam has as well. So what we'll do is like because Adam is defending the proposition, I'll let him go first. He'll give you an opening statement. I'll give a rebuttal to the text or issues he's addressing, and then there can be like a Q&A. And then once that's exhausted, we'll move on. We'll all discuss the first topic, which will be Hebrews chapter 1. Do you have? I'm not sure. Like, do you want me to like share like my Bible work screen so
Yeah,
people
yeah,
can
go for
actually
it because I
see.
think it'll be helpful for people to see the Greek New Testament.
Yeah. So,
So,
and for those who are wondering, we'll be focusing on an English translation, but like if there's nuances of the Greek, that will come up. But which text is the first text you're wishing to address?
we can do Hebrews 1. I was going to address, I have my notes here, John 10:30 and 14:10.
Yeah, if you want, I can actually pop that up on BibleWorks. So what I'll do is like I'll have the Greek New Testament, but do you have like any preference of an English translation you want me to have as a parallel to it as well?
Let's do King James, and can you do more than one?
Yeah, I can. I
King
can do
James
parallels.
and New Revised Standard Version.
Cool. Okay, and I will share my screen here. So, can you see it?
It said you start screen sharing, double click to enter full screen mode. Ah, yes. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So,
It's a
for
nice
those,
fancy setup.
yeah. So that means just know when you want to go to like John 14, and I'll transpose it as well. But
Will do.
yeah, as I said, like 10 minutes. I'm not sure if you have a timer or not. I'll let you know. But as I said, like if you need to take an extra minute or two, I'm not going to be a stickler for that. So you're
Okay.
all good.
Okay, I did have this is one thing I wanted to point out kind of in my introduction. I want to see how you want to do this. Since the church, your church, the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, and the Elijah Message Church, since we both use the King James as our official Bible, I wasn't sure if you wanted to use the Textus Receptus. All of my Greek New Testaments are Nestle Aland. I actually prefer the Textus Receptus, but I
Well,
don't
if you
think
want, I
there's
can
any.
change the Byzantine text, but I
Okay.
don't mind. I don't, unless of course like
Byzantine Textus, it is that's what the Textus Receptus is based on, so that's perfectly fine, isn't it?
yeah. So if you want, I'll use the Byzantine text instead. But as I said,
Yeah,
I'm not really a stickler unless of course there's a significant variant, you know.
yeah.
But if you want,
I don't think
yeah,
there, yeah, for our discussion, I don't think there's any
yeah, I
significant
think there's only going to be like
variation.
the difference, like say, do they capitalize it or do they put an accent? I'm unaware of like any
Yeah.
textual variants, at least in John 10:30, because that is a text I've looked at interacting with
And of course,
Trinitarians enough.
the
But
Johannine comma, which Trinitarians point to. So, but yeah,
but I don't have to point out like that. Say there's the
no.
insertion. We don't have to debate that. Right?
Yeah, no, no, no.
No, that's perfect. So if you want, just let me know when you're good, and I'll start a timer, and then I'll wave you. But as I said, like if you need to like take an extra minute or two, that's all good with me. So you're good.
Okay, I'm good. I'm all set.
Cool. I'll let you. We can start now.
All right. So, one of the things I wanted to start off with is just a general discussion of what modalism is. And I talked about it before, but I think for new viewers, for new listeners, to kind of give them a refresher about what I mean by modalism. So there's different types of modalism. There's classical Sabellian modalism, which says that God works differently in three different epochs. So, for example, in the Old Testament, you have God the Father, and then God shifts modes in the New Testament, and God works as God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. But they're not three different separate persons, as in the Orthodox view of the Trinity, what you get in the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, but just different modes of how God works. Kind of similar, if any of you are familiar with Catholic theology, Karl Rahner talks about basically the different ages, the kind of the economical trinity, which works in different ages. And so that's very similar, even though Rahner would never ever admit that and say that because he says he's an Orthodox Catholic. That's very similar to what classical Sabellianism is. And that is to some extent what my tradition, the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, believes, but it's also different from what we believe as well. So the view that I'm going to be kind of expounding here is basically that Jesus is God, but the divinity of Jesus refers to God the Father, and the humanity of Jesus refers to God the Son. And I think if we look at this biblical text, if we look at the New Testament from that model, a lot of things that may seem to be confusing, that may seem to contradict modalism, will make much better sense. The first text that I wanted to look at, a couple of texts, are uh, are in the Gospel of John. John is kind of for us modalists, kind of one of the proof texts for proof books for modalism. But you have some interesting statements all throughout the Gospel of John, and The first one that you have is in John 10:30. Let me turn to that. I can see it on the screen, but I'll turn to it as well. I have my Nestle Aland Greek New Testament that I bought when I was a divinity school student at Yale. So this has lasted me for about, what is it? It's 2025, right? So this has lasted me for about 22 years. So I've made good use of it. But if we turn to John chapter 10, so we have ego kai ha pater ein esmen. I and the Father are one. And so modalists grab onto this and say, oh, this is definitive proof that Jesus is the same as the Father. Now, counter arguments to that, Roberts made this argument. Your standard Christian theologian would Josh McDowell, others would make this argument as well, that the oneness here refers to unity of purpose, to being in harmony with one another. But that doesn't explain, but if that's the case, then what needs to be addressed is how the Jewish authorities react to that. I always take the term Judean in the Gospel of John's return to the Jewish authorities, not the Jewish people as a whole. I don't want to repeat that kind of anti-Semitic trope, but how the Jewish authorities take this news about Jesus being one with the Father. They get really ticked off about it in quite a few places. So earlier in the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, I'm working and my Father is working as well, the Jewish authorities try to stone Jesus. And so this seems weird. If Jesus was a prophet and he's just saying, I'm working in harmony with God, but I'm not, but me and God, me and the Father aren't identical, it seems weird to me that the Jewish authorities would respond to this and be so upset unless there was a different type of understanding of ein or hen or hen, that term for one that Jesus is using here. So that seems to me evidence, kind of proof that Jesus is referring in a very real sense to him and the Father being identical persons, which for the Jewish authorities would be blasphemy, and this is why they would want to stone and persecute Jesus. Now, the other text I wanted to look at was John 14, 9 and 10. If we can scroll to that. Another classic proof text that modalists often use. And there's some really interesting stuff that's going on here. I love this software. I used to use something similar. Wasn't BibleWorks. It was more of an academic thing when I was in biblical studies. But it was similar. It didn't just have the Greek, but it had even like Ugaritic and stuff like that. But I love this software, Robert. I just have to say. All right, so chapter 14, verse 9. So lege auto ha Jesus, tasuta chrono methemon, emi, kai uk egnokasme Philippe, ha eorakos eme eoraken, ton patera, hos su legis. So Jesus says to him, basically, have I been with you so long, and you agnos.
Sorry, your audio is cut out. Yeah, the audio's cut out for a second. I paused your timer, so.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
All right, I took the mic. I have this big fancy mic that I normally use, but sometimes it has a mind of its own.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. But it's back now. You just if you repeat the last sentence you said.
Okay, were you able to hear me read the Greek?
Yes.
Okay, so the translation, have I been with you so long and you do not know me, O Philip? The one who sees me sees the Father. So ha eorakos eme eoraken ton patera. Now there's some interesting stuff going on there. So eoraken, that's from the Greek term oraio. And there's some interesting translations. Usually it's just translated as to see. It's interesting that in the Septuagint, in the LXX, it's used primarily in relation to visions of the deity, visions of God, which is exactly what we have here. So in Judith, the book of Judith 13:3, you don't have to turn to that. It's used in that regard. From classical Greek, we have some very interesting meanings of the term as well. So in Plato's Phaedrus, it's translated as "prove to be." So if we use that as kind of the context for this, Jesus is saying that I have proven to you that I am the Father. And then, of course, in Sophocles, it means to behold. So again, behold, see. So looking directly at the Father. So some interesting uses of the word ario, both in ecclesiastical and classical Latin, which seem to suggest, especially in with the Septuagint and with Plato, that Jesus is making. He's not just saying that through me you see the Father, but excuse me, when you look at me, you are seeing kind of a divine vision of the Father that I've proven in my interaction with you that I am exactly the Father. So some very interesting terminology going on there. And I think that's all. Actually, can I do one more from John? All right. So John 8:19. And so this is in the big debate. The context of this is Jesus on the Mount of Olives, the beginning of the chapter.
It's happened again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's back. I don't know what's going on with your microphone, but yeah.
That's yeah, I unplugged the microphone. Let me.
I can hear you now, so
Okay, all right. If it happens again, let me know.
Yeah. I'll let you know, but yeah, I'll let you continue. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the context is basically Jesus is having this dispute, this debate with the Jewish authorities. He has a couple of these in the Gospel of John, and the Jewish authorities are basically saying, "We know God. We don't really need your advice or your opinion about anything, Jesus. We know God, ourselves." And so Jesus says in verse 19 of the chapter, well, first the Jewish authorities say, "So elegan un auto, puestin ha pater su." Aperclite Jesus, ute eme ordate, ute tam patera mu, ei eme edete, kai tam patera mu an edete. So they say to him, where is your father? Jesus answers, you do not know me or my father? If ever you knew me, you would also know my father. So that term is a form of gnosko. So oidate is a form of gnosko. And there's a couple things going on here. So first is Jesus is basically affirming this view that we get in the Old Testament that Israel as a whole, as a nation, never actually saw God. And we see this in the book of Exodus. So the Israelites themselves, your common Israelite person, they can't see God, but only Moses and the elders can. And this gets told into a whole priesthood thing that I'm not going to get into today, but I think restoration theology handles this very, very well. So basically Jesus is saying you've never seen God before. And then he says, if you knew me, you would know my father. Now the word for to know is very interesting here. We have a couple of things. In the Greek lexicon, I use Alan Greenbaum for a lot of this. It's one of the ways that you can translate that term for knowing is to know by reflection, which ties in well. And I know Robert's going to talk later on about Hebrews chapter 1. Sorry, my kid's school thing came on. I know Robert's going to talk about this in Hebrews 1, but one of the ways that gnosko and oidate can be taken here is to know by reflection. So Jesus is saying that he is the exact reflection of God the Father in the Old Testament, which the Israelites, which the Jewish people have never seen face to face until now in Jesus being incarnate in his humanity. There is a really interesting rendering of Gnosko and Oida in classical Greek in Menander, his history of Heraclides, where the term kind of has kind of a sexual connotation to know carnally. But the sense is it can be sexual, but it can also be to know to know somebody basically in the flesh, in who they are. So if we take Menander's understanding of Gnosko and Oida, here it would be saying that Jesus is directly the human, the fleshly embodiment of the Father here, which is I think which goes well with the modalistic understanding of Jesus being the humanity of the humanity of God versus the Father being the divinity of God.
Cool. Yeah, that was good. Thanks for the overview. I think some people will be appreciative of how a modalist would approach John's Gospel. We often just hear Trinitarians go about it, so that's fine. Okay, I will stop the share screen. But if you want me to put it back to, like, say, the cross-ex period or any other chain, I'll be doing it for the Hebrews 1 and a few other chains as well when I get there. What I will do now is I'll just take a swig of water first. And I will start my timer now. Well, thanks again for Adam for that interesting approach to the Gospel of John. In my next 10 minutes, I won't have time to go through everything, but hopefully we will actually hash things out in the cross-ex. I'm sure you have questions based on that and other Johannine texts as well, so it'll be fun. And we'll be discussing like the Parakletos text and Jesus' hilasmos and Johannine literature, so that'll be fun. Let me just make a note, like, of course, I'm not a modalist. I believe, for the sake of this debate, like, funny enough, even Trinitarians who don't like me could actually agree with me that at least the person of the Father and Son are numerically distinct from one another. Also, look at the opening statement of our first debate where I discussed the indiscernibility of identicals, but basically for X and Y to be one and the same thing, in this case, one and the same person, they cannot have differed, they cannot differ, they will never be able to differ, and there's no hypothetical possibility they could ever differ as well. I think we can all agree, like, if there was a possibility that the Son and Father could differ in any substantial way, it means that they're not one and the same, in spite of like all the shared titles and functions and roles and glory that they have. So, with that, also John's Gospel. I don't know about you, but I would date John's Gospel later than the three synoptic Gospels. I believe it's late, and I believe it's inter-synoptic tradition. It does reflect a very high Christology. I do believe a high Christology is actually in Mark, the earliest gospel, as is Matthew and so forth, but I believe it's more explicit in John's gospel. I don't believe there was an unnatural development, and I'm thinking you would agree with me that it's a natural progression in terms of the Christology of the first century. Hashtag Mark was written in the 40s. Okay, so as a background, let me just address like some of the texts in order, like John 10 I'll start off with. There's no question that the Father and Son are one. However, as you know, like the one there is actually a neuter one. I know you know this, but like for those who don't know, Greek actually has three ways of saying one: masculine, neuter, and feminine. It's a declined language.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, I'm in an advantage, like although Irish is declined, it's not really declined much these days, but it's a neuter. So that would indicate, like, say, more like say that they're not saying one person. I think an argument could be made like you would have expected, like say a masculine one to be used. It's a neuter, which would indicate like one as a purpose. Now that does not mean in of itself it goes against modalism, but it's not like say a proof text proving it, if you will. How are they one? It kind of comes across like all throughout the Gospel of John. First of all, the Gospel of John is like full of Jewish misunderstanding. When I say Jewish, of course, I mean Jewish leaders. I don't believe the Gospel of John is anti-Semitic.
No, neither do I.
I mean, John was a friggin' Jew, for crying out loud, and so was Jesus. But how are they one? They're one in the salvation of God's people. You see this in verses 27 onwards, like, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. I and my Father one. That's John 10:30. So that's the context. It's about the ones in terms of, say, covenantal salvation and so forth. Notice also, like, the Father gave to the Son. It's not simply to say the divinity gave to the mortal flesh, if you will. So it does seem, at least at first blush, to be against modalism. There's other indications as well, even previous in John 10, how, as the Father know me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. But if they're numerically one and the same person, why would there actually be that kind of interchange, like, say, knowledge of one another? If, like, again, there's, like, some kind of incongruities. Further in John 10, the Jews actually do take up stones, as they do in John 8, and try to, like, kill Jesus. And the reason for this is, like, they misunderstand him. But Jesus in John actually counters using Psalm 82:6, which is a well-known text by Latter-day Saints and others. Have I not said you're gods? You know, as Dale Tuggy, although I disagree with Unitarianism, as we pointed out, if Jesus and the Father are God in either Trinitarian or modalist sense, this does not make sense. Because what's the response? You're accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God, but in your scriptures, it says you are gods. So he's trying to argue from greater to lesser here. You know, if you have a problem with my being called the Son of God, what about all these Elohim, or in the Greek, Theoi, plural Theos, that you believe to be this? It doesn't make sense, because if his argument is like, yes, I'm the same person as God the Father, I'm the same person as the Yahweh of the Old Testament, however you want to frame it in a modalist framework, why do you have a problem with this when your scripture says, you know, gods in this kind of equivocal sense? The argument and the rhetoric that Jesus is engaging in doesn't really seem to be that good, unless, of course, you believe that to be Son of God, at least in this context, doesn't mean that you're God, at least in the sense of God the Father. So maybe we can discuss, like, the use of Psalm 82 in the first century and John's use as well through the cross-ex period, if we have time. The next text that is used, by the way, let me just make a note about the use of N. A similar use of N is with respect to not just the one as the Father, but Jesus and the Father with the glorified Christians at the eschaton and at the present as well. You see this in John 17:22-23. And the glory which thou gavest me, I have given them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them, and thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that thou hast sent me, and hast loved me, as thou hast loved me. So again, the use of the neuter here is used not just for the Father and Son, but the believers as well. And note, like, it's the Father who sends the person to the Son. This harkens back to John 17:3, where the Father is said to be the only one who's true God, in numerical distinction from the person of Jesus. And yet Jesus has a glory that he asks for the Father to restore to him in John 17:5 as per his high priestly prayer. But if Jesus and the Father are numerically one and the same person, how would that work in a modalist framework? And, you know, that's one of the questions I will probably try to ask you during the cross-ex, Adam. Let's see. Okay, that's so many things I want to discuss. Okay, some brief comments about John. I'll just discuss John 8, and we can hash out, like, say, John 14 during the cross-ex period. John 8 does actually present a very high Christology. For instance, John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am, prin Abraham geneste ego imi. That definitely does show, at the very, very least, the personal pre-existence of Jesus. Sorry, Christadelphians and other Socinians. Because before Abraham came into existence, genesti, I am. You know, and we can discuss, like, the Greek grammar, but I think we're both in agreement, like, the use of the verb there and of genestai coupled with ego and me would mean that before Abraham came into existence, I existed, if you will. The personal pre-existence. Yeah. So we're both in agreement with that. So there's no question, very high Christology, but again, there doesn't seem to be numerical distinctions between the person, the Father, and the Son. So again, in spite of, say, the very high Christology and the shared glory and prerogatives of the Father and Son, John's Gospel is very careful to actually distinguish between the Father, who is true God in a unique sense, and Jesus is the ultimate vizier, if you will, you know, and so forth. For instance, in John 8:19, then said they unto him, where is thy Father? Jesus answered, you neither know me nor my Father. If you had known me, you should have known my Father also. So is he actually making an identification here? So, like, dude, I'm the Father. Doesn't seem to be the case in light of some other verses. For instance, in verse 28, then Jesus said unto them, when ye have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall ye know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things. So if Jesus and the Father are numerically one and the same person in the modalist sense, how could the Father teach something to the Son? And if the Son is just the flesh, how can flesh actually learn or be cognizant, depending on, like, one's variation of modalism here? So again, does seem to be, like, some type of, not just a subordination of person here, because the Father teaches something that the Son does not know, but a numerical distinction of person as well. We're dealing with two different indexicals or persons in this text. John 8:38, I speak that which I have seen with my Father, and ye do know that which ye have seen with your Father. So again, Jesus is with the Father as the Logos is with the Hotheos in the opening prologue. But again, there doesn't be, in spite of the very the shared glory and so forth of them, of which there's no question. Again, numerical distinction of person. Again, this does not seem to bode well for the modalist reading, so one has to be a bit careful when it comes to say John 8 and other like texts. And finally, I'll end on this, and we can actually go into the cross-ex. John 8, verse 42, Jesus said unto him, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, i.e. the Father. Neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Again, this is the language of Jesus being the apostello, the apostle of Christ, the shaliach, something that also appears in Hebrews 3:1. How Christ is the apostle. He's the one who's sent out in an ultimate sense by God, i.e. the Father. How can you actually send yourself out? Again, there are these kind of considerations, and we've discussed this in the previous two debates as well, when it comes to, say, similar to concepts and themes and unique Latter-day Saint scripture, where there doesn't be, in spite of the shared attributes and characteristics of the Father and Son, a numerical distinction of person here, again, some type of subordinationism of person, where the Father teaches the Son something, that the Son is dependent upon the Father, and also that it's the Father who sends the Son. The Father does not send himself or commission himself, if you will. Although his name, of course, is in Christ in a unique way, similar to the angel of the Lord in Exodus 22. So about 17 seconds left, but I'll leave it there. So this is where we're going to go to hear the initial, if you have any questions you want to ask me.
From on my end, yes. Yeah. I think those are all really good points. I appreciate your responses with that. I do want to touch later on, because you mentioned kind of high Christology of Mark.
Yeah.
And I do want to touch later on kind of the opening of Mark, because I think that has implications for kind of this modalist, non-modalist debate as well. So but that's something later on.
Yeah.
So I also want to talk, I'll say a little bit about the apostello. So to send, I think we'll see some of this when we get to the Hebrews 1 text that you're going to look at. I think that it's possible, if we understand sending as in a mission of oneself. So God does send oneself. God does send God's self in the Old Testament. So for example, you have the Shekinah. I'll talk about this a little bit more. The glory of God, doxa in the Greek, that is sent, and that is the manifestation of God on the ground amongst humanity. So there is I would argue that there is a precedent for one God sending God's self in a different form. That makes sense.
Yeah, but would you agree with me, like those instances of, say, the idea like shalak or apostello, that they're not the normative way, it's like an exceptional way. And also coupled with the fact, like, say, Jesus does say like how he learned of the Father, he was with the Father. Again, I would just say, like, say, you can find like these exceptional cases where like it seems like the God sends himself, and of course, like that's assumed like it's not the angel of Yahweh, it's not some messenger. We can
just, Shekinah,
definitely. But at the same time, like the normative meaning of, like, say, apostello in Greek,
someone sending somebody.
Yeah, that it would be like, say, analogous would be like, say, the term adelphos, brother, adelphi, sister, in familial contexts. Yeah. Like, you sure you could like find an instance where it means like a half sibling or like a near relative in like literature, but like the normative meaning in the New Testament would be like a uterine brother, which we're neither one of us like are EO or Roman Catholic, so as an analogous, that would be like, say, the normative function of apostello or apostelline, or if you want to parse it, would be like a numerical distinction, because like how apostello is used elsewhere in John's gospel and the synoptics is like, for instance, John the Baptist is sent out using the same verb and so forth. So like the normative meaning would be like, say, one, numerically distinct person, and two, at least functionally subordinate to the person who sends them.
I'd be curious in the semantic range. Let me see something. It's a really great point you're making. Just bear with me just for a second here. You can't see my screen, can you?
No, but I can pop up, you can share your screen if you want. I'll let you have the function to do that. But like apostello, according to BDAG, it means to dispatch someone for the achievement of some objective, send a way out. To dispatch some meshes, send or have something done. You know, um, you know, just like the basic meaning, if you will, of these, like say, patristic and
yes. Which you're absolutely right about. In patristic, and I'm just looking here. There is a very interesting variant with Aristophanes, meaning to put off or to doff, whatever the heck that means. But if so in Aristophanes is comicus. So if you understand it as putting off a divinity for the humanity, but yes, I would have to concede that
and to be fair,
within the ecclesiastical context, it means exactly what you said.
And like I know you're not saying this, but like say when a Koine Greek context, a better verb would have been used like it would have been a kanao, like Paul does use in Philippians 2. And because classical Greek is useful, but it's not as, but like as you know, and I'm not saying you're well in the case on this, like the semantic domain can like diminish or increase over time as well. So okay.
Different types of Greek that my colleague in the classics department over at Lawrenceville, he teaches them. So Attic, Koine. I'm not skilled with all of them, but
just a question from my end about like the use of the father and I are one, the use of the neuter, and you would agree with me, like say that neuter is used in John 17, 22, and 23 to describe the oneness, not just of the Father and Son, but like the oneness of the Son and the believers. Yeah. So would you agree with me that in and of itself, that's not like proof positive of modalism? At most, it would be something consistent with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's interesting because so you have eus for the masculine, mia, I think, for feminine, and n as neuter. So that's it's interesting that the neuter is used there when you could use the masculine.
And just related to like you would agree with like say the verb we are one is used. It's not simply I are one or I is one heard one two person. Like the plural we are is used in the Greek as well.
Yeah.
So how would you, as someone who holds to modalism, would actually understand, like, say, the use of, say, plural pronouns, plural verbs describing the father and son in this and other related contexts?
Like Esmond, for example. I would, going back to kind of the definition of modalism I have, you have kind of the divine and human natures of God interacting with each other. So God the Father, the divinity of Jesus, interacting with God the Son, the humanity of Jesus, which I think, and going back to our conversation last, with the first vision and everything, and the idea of personages, I think is something that's similar that's happening, with when Joseph Smith encounters God. He's seeing kind of a dialogue between these two different natures because he has to see the whole entire, because Joseph Smith is the bomb and he is the prophet, and he has to see the entire nature of God. So he sees all aspects of literally all the modes of God interacting with one another.
Yeah, and I know that's how you like get around approach the baptismal scene. But maybe I should ask, like, do you believe, like, say like the historical Jesus, do you believe like functionally he was like two people or two persons, or do you believe he was just one person and the humanity was like impersonal but the divinity was personal?
That's an excellent question. I think that I hadn't thought about that deep before. I think that the biblical witness, I would argue that the biblical witness has both at certain times. I would say the majority of the time, it's what you said, he's just a single person, but there are times, and going back, so for example, when Stephen sees Jesus, when Stephen gets stoned, not stoned by drugs, but stoned by the Pharisees, and he sees the doxatheu, Tutheu, and he sees Jesus sitting at the right hand. I think that he's seeing like there's Jesus being two different modes. But for the most part, Jesus is just one mode, one person. The historical Jesus is one mode. It's the human Jesus that's walking around doing stuff.
Okay, so you wouldn't like side for his Nestorianism, like say two persons functioning in one.
No.
Indexical. Yeah, no, that's fine. No, do you have any other questions? Because I do have some questions based on John, but it'll be related, like say his presentation of Christ as preposition in my third section. So if you have any questions, and then we can move on to my first opening statement.
No, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll hopefully remember to ask you about the presentation of Christ as hilasmos in in 1 John vis-a-vis the atonement. Okay, that was a good one. I'm just going to
That took us quite a while too.
Yeah, I mean, if we have to do part 2, we can do part 2. Just going to take a swig of water because my medication dries my mouth off. Okay, so for those who are wondering, we actually have 3 comments or statements, if you will, each, and we'll be interacting with that. So that was our round 1 for Adam. Now, my round 1 thing, what I will be doing is I will be focusing on Hebrews chapter 1. So I will share my screen. Just make sure you can actually see the Greek, King James, and NRSV on your end of things there, Adam.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, let's see if I can actually do this in 10 minutes. Okay, I will start my timer now. Okay, just as background for Hebrews, I believe Hebrews was written just before the Jewish War, so pre-67. Even radical liberal skeptics like Richard Carrier would agree with me. And it presents the highest Christology, I would argue, in the Greek New Testament alongside the Gospel of John. And I know, I'm not sure how popular opinion of this is, but one, I believe Paul gave the sermon that's based on, Luke wrote it, and 3, it's the most epic New Testament book there is. Come fight me on it. So in terms of background, I would argue that, yes, Jesus is presented in a very high, exalted way. He's personally pre-existent. He's the active agent of the Genesis creation, but there's still a numerical distinction between him and God, i.e. the Father. And throughout this discussion, when I use the term God, underscores otherwise stated, I just mean the person of the Father to avoid confusion. So verses 1 and 2, God, i.e. the Father, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in the time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, by whom he also made the worlds. In this text, we actually speak of how the Christ event is the most important event in salvation history. Not that Christ was passive or inactive or non-existent, if you will, in the Old Testament period, just like he's the sine qua non, if you will, of Revelation, particularly the resurrection and ascension. But notice, it's God who spoke through the prophets, and in the same way he spoke through the Son. There's a numerical distinction of persons, just as the prophets, e.g. Moses, is numerically distinct from God the Father, so is Jesus. It also says, having these last days spoken to us by his Son. This is a theme that's repeating verses 10 to 12, which I will hopefully address momentarily. It actually reads, Dia ukai ipaiusin tus eonos, who through him, God also created either the worlds or the ages. It doesn't matter how you want to translate the term eonos here. It just means that dia plus the genitive means through the agency of. So it seems to be a numerical distinction of person. God as a different person created through the person of Jesus. If you look at Hebrews, how dia plus the genitive is used, it's used in this agentival sense. For instance, Hebrews 1:9, 1:14, 2:1, 7:24, and 7:25. To give just one example in the context of Hebrews 1, are not all the angels, spirits in the divine service sent to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? 1:14, just after quoting Psalm 110, verse 1. Hebrews 1:3, who, Christ being in the brightness of his, the Father's glory, and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. So this is Christ in his exalted, resurrected state. He sits down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, which is a circumlocution of saying God the Father. So again, this does seem to be like there's 2 numerical different people or indexicals in view here. What's rather interesting is the term reflection here. This is a hapax legomenon vis-a-vis the Greek New Testament. The
explain what that is.
Yeah, hapax legomenon is a word that's only used once in the text. I should use that.
You don't see it ever again anywhere else.
It does, however, appear once elsewhere in the Septuagint, and that is Wisdom chapter 7:26. Speaking of wisdom, for she, wisdom, is a reflection apogasma of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Now, with respect to apogasma, while some wish to argue as an active vice, radiance in 1:3, the text shows its passive, i.e. reflection. The Greek conjunction kai, English and, is here a coordinating conjunction, which combines the first and second parts, the first part being a passive character of a parallel couplet. Due to this fact, as much as many, especially Trinitarians, want to argue otherwise, it's passive, i.e. the reflection, Christ is the reflection of the glory of the Father. He's not the source of it. The Father is. So it does seem to be, especially in the passive reading, which is favored by even some Protestants such as F.F. Bruce and these commentary Hebrews, albeit grudgingly. It's the Father who's the source of the Father, Christ's divinity. At the very most, the Father alone is author theos, or God in an underived sense. Now, Hebrews 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 13 teaches something I think we can both agree on. Jesus is not an angel. So I'll skip over that, but I think we are both in agreement that not functionally you can say he's a messenger, but ontologically by nature he's not, contra JW theology. However, what's rather interesting is the use of the Old Testament texts in making this case. There's a numerical distinction between the person, the Father, and Son. Of course, Christ is typified. He's the antitype fulfillment of the Davidic king and so forth. And many of the Davidic king ideas are actually exemplified in these texts. For instance, verse 4, so he has become better than the angels to the extent that he has inherited a name more excellent than theirs. Now, how can someone inherit a name more excellent than theirs if they're the person, the Father? The Father can't inherit a name above any other name. So again, there's a numerical distinction, something that appears in Philippians 2, 5 to 11. Maybe we'll discuss that momentarily. Another text is verses 5 to 6. For example, to which of the angels did God say, you're my son, today I become your father, Psalm 2, verse 7, and I will become his father and he will become my son, 2 Samuel 7, 14. But when he again brings his firstborn into the inhabited earth, he says, and that all of God's angels do obeisance or worship him. And that's Deuteronomy 34, 2, 43, and in the Septuagint, Psalm 97, verse 7. And verses 7 to 9, also he says about the angels, he makes these angels spirits and these ministers a flame of fire. That's Psalm 104, 4 in the Septuagint. But about the Son, he says, God is your throne forever and ever, and the scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You loved righteousness and you hated lawlessness. This is why God, your God, appointed you with the olive exaltation more than your companions. Psalm 45, 6 to 7. With respect to Psalms 45, 6 to 7, what's rather interesting is this presents Christ as God in comparison to the Father in a secondary sense. The passage is one of the rare New Testament texts that uses theos, God of Jesus. Others, John 1, 1, there's a textual variation in John 18, and although except Granville Sharp's canon, Titus 2:13, 2 Peter 1, 1, it's not as clear-cut as Daniel Wallace makes it out to be, but I think we can both agree it's very rare outside John 20, 28 and a few other texts where Christ is called theos, But be that as it may, this is one of the rare instances where everyone, including radical Unitarians like Anthony Buzzard, will agree Christ is called God.
Yeah.
Now, what's rather interesting, in this text, Christ is differentiated not simply from the person of the Father, but he's differentiated from theos, God, literally the God. This can be further seen by the fact that this is a midrash of sorts of Psalm 45, 6 to 7, where in its original context, it's a royal coronation text for the Davidic king, of whom Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment. We can all agree there's partial fulfillments of 2 Samuel 7, but Christ is the ultimate fulfillment. He's the antitype, if you will, the fulfillment of the type. Both the Hebrew and the Greek Septuagint predicates God upon the king, and yet there is a God, in the case of Jesus, God the Father, above him. It's God who anoints him. So again, you can't anoint yourself, and I'm sure there's going to be in the argument, maybe it's a reflexive and we can discuss this, but I don't think the Greek or Hebrew supports that. The Septuagint reads the same as Hebrews. The Hebrew literally reads Elohim, your Elohim, and in the Greek it's theos, the theos of you. Bentley Hertz, I'll just skip this. And verse 13 uses Psalm 110, verse 1, but because that's going to be my next section, I'll just skip over it. I'll just focus on Hebrews 1, 10 to 12, which is actually a quotation from the book of Psalms. It's Psalm 102, verses 25 to 27 in the Hebrew. But what's rather interesting, the author of Hebrews is actually quoting from the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, the chapter and verses are different. It's Psalm 101, 26 to 28. And thank goodness we're not dealing with Jeremiah, because that would be all over the place in terms of difference of verses and chapters. What's rather interesting, as I'll note here, and time is fleeting, this, i.e. Hebrews 1, 10 to 12, is a quotation of Psalm 102, 25 to 27, or LXX 101, 26 to 28, and it's applied to the person of Jesus. I know some commentators trying to get around that, but I think it's pretty clear Jesus is being addressed here. Most scholars take this as a reference to the Genesis creation, not simply the new creation. This seems to be the case in light of the fact that this creation will come to end, as it will, quote, wear out like clothing. Furthermore, the Greek speaks of Jesus having engaged in this activity in the active vice. You founded etelem me il asis, the indicative active ars of temaiao, to lay a foundation. What's rather interesting is that if you look at the Septuagint that the author of Hebrews is quoting, if you look at the Hebrew and Greek, the Septuagint understands how to vocalize the text a bit differently, where it's not the Father or God who afflicts the speaker, but he actually answers the speaker. In Psalm 1 or 224 in the King James, which is following the Masoretic, he weakened my strength in the way, he shortened my days. However, the Septuagint vocalizes ein nun he, that verb, as not to afflict, but to answer. The Lexham Septuagint renders it as declare to me the fewness of my days. Ein nun a, just the consonantal root, can be vocalized he afflicted or he answered, and the Septuagint follows the latter using the verb aprokinomai, to answer. Here the psalmist depicts a conversation between two persons, God and the person he answers, and the person he answers is the referent of the following verses, of which Hebrews 1:10-12 quotes and applies to Jesus. So the author of the book of Hebrews, who I believe to be Luke, is actually using a text where it's actually a conversation between God, Yahweh, and the person he answers. And let me just end with this from a quotation from Bacon from his 1902 article in Hebrews 1:10-12, where he discusses the Septuagint and the Hebrew, and I'll end with this. Finally, in the Septuagint and Vulgate rendering of ena by aprokitete or respondit, we have the explanation of how, in Christian circles at least, the accepted messianic passage could be made to prove the doctrine of the Messiah is none other than the pre-existent wisdom of Proverbs 8, through whom, according to our author, verse 2, God made worlds. Indeed, we shall not be going too far if with Bruce we say it is possible that the writer of Hebrews regarded the text, Psalm 1 or 2, as messianic because in his view, creation was the work of the pre-existent Christ. But it is equally possible that he ascribed creative agency to Christ out of regard to this and other similar texts believed to be messianic on other grounds. I went a little over by, I just hope that's okay, but that's my very, very brief notes on Hebrews, and I can't believe I almost did it in time.
That was awesome, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks. By the way, if you want, for those who are wondering, like I do have a folder of some random notes and stuff like that. So if you want it, drop me a message on Facebook or email me, and I'll send you the hodgepodge of stuff I have. So, do you want me to have the Hebrews text up as well as the screen share?
No, this is fine. This is perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Yes, Hebrews is one of the most awesome books of the New Testament. Had a friend when I was in graduate school, Amy Peeler, whose focus is on the book of Hebrews. I have always had a great fondness, even before I was a modalist, for the first verse, which I think for the first two verses, which I think, in my view, in my opinion, are excellent kind of example of the dynamic of modalism. So you have, I'll just read the King James, won't put you through my Greek at the moment. So God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. So you have the contrast, you have the divinity of Jesus, God the Father, how the divinity of Jesus acted in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible. And then you have the contrast in these last days has spoken to us by his son. So wait, where is yes, so episkatu, tone hemeron, two-tone, elalesan, humin, and hio. So you have the divinity of Jesus contrasted to the way that Jesus is acting in the New Testament in Jesus's humanity. So you have the Son, the reference to Jesus and Jesus' humanity, compared with the way that the divine Jesus acted in the Old Testament by speaking through the prophets. So just in a personal way, I think that's the way I read those two verses is kind of an excellent kind of modalistic understanding of God there. Robert raised a bunch of great points. I want to focus on verse 3, as Robert probably suspected that I would. And in particular, a couple of things. I think Robert hit the nail on the head with some of this stuff. So os hon apogasma tes doxes kai character tes hypostaseos out too. So I want to focus on some of those terms. So Robert is absolutely correct about apogasma. It's passive. So I think the Latin Vulgate, we didn't get into the Latin Vulgate. I'm sorry. I know we're only supposed to be focusing on the Greek New Testament, but I think it's a perfect passive participle in the Latin Vulgate, if I recall. So the reflection of the glory of his glory, and then you have character, taste, hypostasios out too. So that term character, we get the word character from that. A lot of really interesting things going on with that term. This for me, and I know Robert's argued for a non-modalist point understanding of this verse. This for me is basically the linchpin, the penultimate proof text coming from the greatest book of the New Testament, the proof text for modalism here. So the term character in classical Greek, to draw on some examples, that term character is often used. Menander uses it. Philodemus uses it. Arianus uses it to refer to two things: a coin stamp or a coin type or individual nation. Nature. Now, this is important. So with coinage, same as kind of today, but not really. We don't do this today. But the coinage, Roman coinage, Greco-Roman coinage, would have the image of a particular person on it, and that represented kind of like the Zelum in kind of a Near Eastern context. That represented the authority, the presence of that person, even if that person wasn't physically around. So the coin was kind of the embodiment, the manifestation of the person that was on the image. Now, we don't do this now. So, for example, if you have a penny, you know, that's not, you know, Abraham Lincoln's not the penny, but is Abraham Lincoln on the penny? I should know this as the one who's the U.S. citizen here. So
I'm the Mick. What would I know?
I know. So anyway, so um that is basically so that the term character is used there. I think that's very telling, saying that, you know, Jesus is the stamp, is the embodiment, is the representation of the Father. So that's very interesting to me. There is an evangelical commentary on Bible Studies Tools, which says that which translates character, as the Greek term character, as the perfect reflection of the majesty of God. So again, this is for me the linchpin. This is the definitive proof text. I would go, if you told me where's modalism in the Bible, where's modalism in the New Testament, I would say this. So Jesus is the reflection, the thing that's emitted, being the perfect embodiment of the Father. And then we have hypostasios, which causes a lot of trouble later on in Christianity with the Nicene Creed and stuff like that. But a couple of really interesting ways to take that term. So most dictionaries, most lexicons will take that as substance, reality, assurance. So Jesus is, in effect, the substance, the reality of the Father on earth. And that makes sense. So Jesus, as God the Son, representing the humanity of Jesus. Jesus is the human representation of the Father on earth. So the way that I would translate this whole thing is who being the emission, or having been the reflection of the glory and character of his substance. I don't think that there is any higher terminology that can be used to connect Jesus with the Father, to show that Jesus and the Father are one. So, and I love I think the author of Hebrews, Paul or whatever, is a genius here. So he starts off verses 1 and 2, showing how the modes that God has operated in different time periods, one in the Old Testament, one in the author's own time, and then makes this direct connection to using these terminologies: character, apogasma, hypostasis. All these terms are used to show a direct connection between Jesus and the Father. The last point, and Robert pointed this out, and I think it was a really good observation, how ha theos is used in contrast to theos. That shouldn't be surprising. So this goes, I don't know if we'll get to discuss this today, but in 1 Corinthians 8, verses 4 to 6, which seems to be one of those, and I will fully admit this. I try to be fair. This is a text that on the surface seems to go against modalism completely. But I think that if we understand the different titles for God, we can see a modalism going on here. So in the Septuagint, the name for God is Kyrios ha Theos, so Lord the God. Um, and I think so in the New Testament, we have the term Kyrios, the Lord, referring to Jesus, but the God here, Hatheos, refers to the divinity of God. So we take Kyrios as referring to the earthly Lord here, Jesus, in God in human form, and then Hatheos as referring to God the Father. So I think this makes sense when you see kind of the interchange here with the author of Hebrews quoting the Psalms, kind of the interchange here. We have the two modes of God in conversation with each other, which is what we get elsewhere in the Restoration Scriptures as well. That's all I have to say.
Let me just stop the share screen while we do the cross-ex. Let's see. Well, I have... Cool. I have a few questions based on what you said. I'm not sure if we'll have time to address 1 Corinthians 8, but we can actually maybe do that at a later time if
yeah.
we have to do a project. I'll ask my first question. Based on Hebrews 1, you would agree with me, like, at least on the prima facie reading, like, there's a numerical distinction between, like, God, speaking here of the Father, of course, and the human agents he spoke through in the Old Covenant.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So apart from, like, say, assuming modalism, why do you think, like, we should try to read this as, example of a dynamic of I can't read my hand around, but you said something like, say, a dynamic example of modalism. That there's some, would it be better to read, like, just as there's numerical distinction between God and the, say, Moses and the Old Covenant prophets he spoke through, that is a numerical distinction of person between God, here speaking of the Father, and the person of Jesus.
I'm taking it as so when it's talking about God speaking through the prophets, I'm taking that as God the Father, the divinity of Jesus, acting as that worked in the Old Testament. Now I get your point saying, as it looks in the Greek, that the comparison is not between God and the Son, but the Son and the prophets.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
because it uses, the Greek does use the term Hios, Son. Yeah. So it does seem, at least at first blush, that it's not speaking, like, say, the divinity versus humanity of the single person of God in a modalist sense, but one person sending a bunch of other people in the past, and now, as the ultimate example of revelation, he sends this unique Son, Hios, of him. So it doesn't seem like a person that's in view who's the Hios of this Theos, the son of this God, if you will, if you don't know Greek, as opposed to, like, say, the divinity sending, like, say, the humanity and other issues as well, vis-a-vis modalism.
I think my emphasis there is on the time period. So very important to me, Robert, is the ep eskatu ton hemeron, and that the contrast here is that God is working in a different way than God has worked in the past. And so
but would you agree with me, like, say, that in of itself is not, like, necessary for modalism? Like, anyone, like a Trinitarian and the hardest thing would agree, like, say, Jesus, because he's the ultimate revelation sine qua non. That doesn't mean, like, say, it has to be the same person as God. It can be just, like, someone who's unique,
Yeah. But God is, I think, also for myself, not only the time period, but the lalesa. So God is speaking in the Old Testament. And then God, yes, through the prophets, but then the Son is speaking now. So for me, that seems to be a correlation. So you have God speaking in both time periods, but in the first section, God speaks in God's divinity, and then God speaks in God's humanity as the Hios.
Yeah, sure. No, I understand what you mean, but like I'll let you ask a question.
Oh yeah, no, that's it. That's it.
No, yeah, but I'll let, if you have any questions you want to ask me, like we can take turns one after another. So I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's it. From yeah, no questions.
Okay, let's see. I wish I could read my handwriting, but like in all 8 languages, it's dreadful. We can address the Hoteos issue. We can get to 1 Corinthians 8. We can discuss like easy expander speaking the Shema. But
how do you, I guess the question I have, how do you take the character, the Greek term character and hypostasis? You think that those are significant there? Because from like I said, for me, this verse is kind of the definitive verse for modalism.
Yeah, you said it's the definitive proof text for modalism. Well, okay. Well, first of all, like because you have to read it in context, and we can both agree. Like Jesus is the apogasma, and that's a passive. I think I'm glad you agree with me. I don't have to kind of go through like say why it can't be an active in this context and how it's used elsewhere in say Wisdom 7:24-25, or verse 26, I believe. Here, like Jesus is not alter theos, he's not God in an underived sense. He gets his glory from someone else, and that seems to be the God. And we can discuss, we'll definitely discuss like because I do have like a few questions about verses 10-12 momentarily, but just focusing on 3. The term character, as you know, and I'm kind of glad you brought up the kind thing. The image on the kind is not the same as the original referent. The image of say Abraham Lincoln on a US penny is not Abraham Lincoln. It's like a reflection, as you mentioned. Like a very good analogous would be like the use of Tselem and Demut in Hebrew, and that's how I would read it. Like, yes, Christ is the character of the hypostatus, of God the Father, but again, it does seem like, especially with reference like say apogasma in the passive, and I do apologize for those who are listening who are kind of wondering what the heck these linguistic and theology nerds are speaking about, but this is where like it unfortunately you have to go into a bit of a weeds. It doesn't mean like say he is deriving it from somewhere external to himself.
Yeah.
So it's not I know you want to jump in, but let me just like clarify my position here. It seems to be internal. So like I'm sure like because you're a fan of Servetus, you're familiar with like the debates like is the Father alone alter theos, or is all 3 persons alter theos? I hold that the Father is alter theos according to the theology of Hebrews, but the Son, in a non-Arian sense, derives his divinity from the person of the Father through perichoresis. That's, I think, Johannine Christology as well.
Yeah.
So he's not the source of it. The Father is the font, if you will, of the divinity, and Christ is dependent in some sense upon someone external to himself, i.e. the Father, and that's why the passive is used in these and other texts as well.
Yeah. I guess, and again, going with, I think you're correct rendering the passive here. If Jesus is the reflection, not the, if
that he's the reflection of the source, but he's not the source. Yeah.
Yeah, but that implies kind of an equality, which if we're going to do at least Trinitarian, even Utah LDS theology implies if something's a reflection, that in my view doesn't suggest the type of subordination that you get with a understanding of sonship that you get in Trinitarianism and in Latter-day Saint theology, traditional Latter-day Saint theology.
Well, I would just say, like, say the subordinationism is because he's dependent upon the Father. The Father is alter theos, and the Son is not. So that there's the at least at the very minimum, there's a functional subordination just based on these texts. But yeah,
I would also say one other thing with the Zelum, which is kind of going very Old Testament-y, but the Zelum oftentimes I talk about this sometimes in my Old Testament classes. The Zelum is seen, I know there's some debate about this amongst Near Eastern scholars, biblical scholars. The Zelum is seen as the actual physical manifestation of the person it represents. So if you have a Zelum of a king, that Zelum is the king's presence in that land while the king is gone. But that's a debatable point.
Well, yeah, but like I'm sure, like in the ancient Near East, you're familiar with, like, say, the Zelum was not just like it's not like either or. It's like a 3-dimensional image, but also like say it's imbued with the authority of the person whose image the person is creating. So, verses 10-12. First of all, you would agree with me that is a quotation from the book of Psalms, namely Psalm 1 or 2, and you would agree that the author of Hebrews, the referent, he's using the of the Son in this context.
Yeah.
How do you actually in like say modalism and I would argue, like, especially like the fact he's quoting from the Septuagint, and I know this is a bit of a technical argument. So if you want to like say pass, and we can just like focus on just 10 to 12 in isolation. The Septuagint does seem like to vocalize the text differently than the Masoretic, where it's not God afflicts the speaker, but he enters the speaker. And in the next few verses, it's the passage that is quoting Hebrews 1 to 12. So it seems to be like a conversation between God and the speaker is interpreted as being Christ, who said to have laid the foundation. And I would argue that's clearly the Genesis creation, not simply the new creation and so forth. So I think, and the agentival language that's used in verse 2 as well. How do you square that with modalism, where the Father, it's just one person who's the creator, not one person acting through the agency of another who's the creator, if you will, the Genesis creation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Robert. I take that as with, I think the same thing's going. You mentioned the baptismal story in the baptismal event in the Synoptic Gospels. I think that there are times where you have a conversation, within God's self, and I think this is one of the examples of that, where and so that doesn't necessarily negate for me. That doesn't negate modalism for me. It's just the different modes of God and interacting with each other. But I will concede and I will admit that for a I can see where, from a Trinitarian standpoint, and from kind of a henotheistic standpoint, I don't want to, forgive me for using that term for LES theology. I don't think that's fair. But where separate personages, separate persons would, and understand that type of understanding will work much better.
And we can go into like next section after this, but like because this follows like the quotation from Psalm 45, like God, your God is anointed to you. Do you believe that's an internal debate or discussion or dialogue as well? And if so, like how do you understand like the idea of like a 19 in the text? Because it says like God, your God has anointed you, and so forth. So, and this is the Old Testament text that's quoted just prior to verses 10 to 12, the quotation from Psalm. So
yeah,
not necessarily like say the distinction between theos and hotheos. You're going to mention it briefly, but the idea like say a 19 and so forth.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, that's something I have to think about. I'd have to think
No,
about
that's fine.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. Cool. We will go on to your next section. So if there's any biblical text you want me to put up on the screen, just let me know what it is.
Yes. So I have some. I'm trying to think about where to go from here. Some of the Old Testament prophecies. So and the references to God the Father in the Septuagint. Now, I don't want to go too far off topic there, but there are a couple of references to God as Father in the Septuagint. There's a whole debate amongst biblical scholars. Robert knows this, but the general listeners might not know it. Whether ancient Israelites understood God as Father, if they could, in Old Testament times, and
They did.
yeah, and I agree, but there's some debate with that. So Isaiah 63, verse 16, for example. So Sugar et pater humon, for you are our father. Isaiah 64:8, both coming from third Isaiah, Kai Nun, Kyrie pater humon, Su, and now, Lord, you are our father. And then the very famous one, from Malachi 2, verse 10, Uki pater et is paton humon. There, the et is masculine. Uki theos et is Ektisen humas. So, is there not one Father for all of us? Did not one God create us? So, my point, I guess, making reference to all of these, my point is that if we understand the God mentioned in the Old Testament as Father, as God the Father, then if Jesus, in my view, in modalistic view, if Jesus can be identified with that God, then it follows that Jesus is the Father. So, couple of prophecies in the Old Testament that are used in the New. So you have Malachi 3:1, and this gets to the introduction to Mark, which Robert talked about earlier, which I think, and Robert hit the nail on the head. It's a very high Christology coming right off the bat. So Mark chapter 1, and you did it, Mark, to the 40s, Robert. That's really early, man.
Yeah, I know.
I know kind of goes a little bit off topic. Any reason for that?
I don't think it has knowledge of the Gentile mission, and there's some indications like the debate about the Corban rule predates Matthew's discussion about the Corban rule. So,
yeah. Very cool, very cool. Okay, so we have this prophecy from Malachi 3:1, so which introduces Mark. Let me get my notes here. So idu apostello to agalumu prasapusu hos kataskuesai ton adon su. So I am sending my messenger, the messenger understood as John the Baptist, to prepare your way before your face, to prepare your way. Now Malachi, the you there is a definite reference to God. So here we have Jesus being associated directly, and I think this goes back to Robert's point about a high Christology, directly with the God of the Old Testament. And if we understand from a modalist perspective, from a modalist reading, if we understand the God of the Old Testament to be God the Father, as these references in Isaiah and Malachi seem to suggest, then that itself would suggest that Jesus is directly linked to God the Father, is to be directly associated with God the Father. Let's see. So verse 3 in Mark, eto maisate tain adon kuriou. So prepare the way of the Lord. Again, kurios here referring to quotation from Isaiah 40 verse 3, referring to God, the Hebrew God here. If that's understood as God the Father, then again, a direct reference to Jesus. The prophecy is being seen as referring to Jesus, which would link Jesus to God the Father. I know that's some kind of evangelical apologetics there, but I wanted to get your thoughts about those. So it was either that or talk about the wine press in Mark chapter 12.
Okay, I'll give my 10 minutes overview based on just what I heard, and then we can take it from there if you want. So,
okay.
Oh, by the way, in case people are wondering, I actually told Adam well in advance what text I'll be discussing, and I have no clue what text he wants to discuss. So, okay, let's see. Okay, let me just make a few comments.
I was all over the place, so take.
It's fine. No, I'm sure it'll come out through the cross-ex. It's all good. Let me just make a few comments about language. And again, I discussed this in the opening statement through the first debate we had on restoration of scriptures. There's what's called facet and rigid designators in linguistics. That is, a facet designator is something that actually has multiple meanings depending on the context in which they are pasting. A rigid designator only strictly has one reference, if you will. To give an example, I have a mother, Adam has a mother, but it would be a fallacy to claim like mother there has the same reference, and the same when it comes to the even instances like Theos, Elohim, and so forth. And the same when it comes to Av or Pater. So even if one wants to think like, say, Father equals God the Father simpliciter, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, in of itself, the title itself is actually a facet, not rigid designator. You kind of see this like even in uniquely Latter-day Saint scripture, like Mosiah 3, where Christ is called the Father, not because he's the person of the Father, but because he's the agent of creation. You're going to see this as well, like, say, the well-known Emmanuel prophecy, where he will be eternal Father, according to the Hebrew, Father of eternity, depending on which textual tradition you want to go with. So, like, even if you will, and for the sake of argument, let's just say, like, Father here means God the Father. In of itself, it's not problematic because there's an idea, like, say, agency as well. You have angels, you have prophets who often speak as if they are Yahweh all throughout the Old Testament. There's instances in Deuteronomy where Moses speaks of as if he's Yahweh or Jehovah in first person. But of course, like with the idea, like say the Chaldaic or the apostle, concept, they speak because they have his authority embedded in them in some type of temporal or eternal sense. Compare the angel of the Lord in Exodus 22, especially in Masoretic 19 for nerds out there. So when it comes to say various issues like this, does the Gospel of Mark, and I'll focus on Mark, because you kind of mentioned, like, does Mark actually present the person of the Father and Son as numerically one and the same? Now, I don't know if you which textual tradition you go with when it comes to, say, Mark 1:1. There's some textual traditions that add the Son of God. I actually think that's earlier, but it's not a big deal here because you
In
can see
Nestle
process.
Land, I'm so glad you mentioned that. In Nestle Land, they puts it in parentheses
Yeah,
as if it's not there, but I know you can't see that. But
yeah,
yeah, some textual traditions do have Son of God. Yep, he who
yeah.
thinks.
Yeah, there's no question Christ is like the ultimate agent, if you will. So, of course, like, even if you believe he's pre-existent as I do, he can speak with the authority of God and actually speak as if he's the Father. That's actually part of Latter-day Saint theology, and I know you know this, Adam, but for those who don't know, in June of 1916, the First Presidency, in light of the research of James Talmage, issued one of my favorite proclamations, an exposition of the relationship between the Father and the Son, where it discusses like what's called divine investiture, where the Father invests the Son with this unique capability to speak as if he is God, the Father himself. So there's no real issue here. The real issue is, though, is like, does the New Testament, and we'll focus specifically on the Gospel of Mark for my opening statements, distinguish the person between the Father and the Son? And of course, like, the very first chapter, which you mentioned, where it has the quotation from like Isaiah and Malachi, it also has the baptism scene, because everyone wants to discuss the baptism scene, and I think this is like, we might as well address it. I'm not being difficult, because I know this is like the main anti-Trinity mistaken Trinitarian, actually modalist proof text, if you will. And what's rather interesting, like in Mark's account, the Father speaks from heaven at the baptism, and then the Spirit descends from the dove. So, like, prima facie, it does seem to indicate that there's a distinction of person between the Father and Son, because they're in different geographical, temporal, spatial locales, if you will. So prima facie, that's the case. What's rather interesting is, like, there's an Old Testament text that's used previously in Hebrews, which we discussed, but also in Mark, and that is Psalm 2:7, which is, in its historical context, a psalm used for at the anointing or investiture of a Davidic king. Where because Hebrew does not actually have the verb to like coronate someone a king or queen. It uses the term of begetel, yalad in Hebrew, where like a king is begotten. Yes,
yeah.
Especially and of course, like, because Christ is the ultimate begotten, the ultimate king. It's really apropos that this kind of begetel language will be used throughout the Gospels. What's rather interesting, and this is from a scholar, Carl Hughes, which I read only a few days ago, so Providence, I suppose, scriptural exegesis and making early Christology. He's talking about the use of Psalm 2:7 in Hebrews 1:5, but it can also be transposed to the use of it in Mark's Gospel, where this is the Father speaking to the Son. The central part of the verse quoted in Hebrews 1:5, and here as well in Mark 1, as well as alluded to in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' baptism, is thus construed as a record of the Father's speech at an earlier theodramatic time. And given that early Christian interpreters were clear that the Father spoke these words to Jesus, the logical consequence is that the Son must have, and the actual conversation with the Father being recounted in Psalm 2:7 at some point prior to the time when the Son was recounting it. So personal pre-existence, but also numerical distinction of person. While the author of Hebrews, and I would argue Mark as well, does not comment on this broader context, the following verse, with its reference to when God brings the firstborn into the world, makes clear his understanding of when the divine dialogue took place. Hebrews 1:6 compared to Deuteronomy 32:4-3. The implications of the Father originally spoke the words of Psalm 2:7 to the pre-existent Son at the time of the Son's incarnation. So, as I said, I didn't know exactly what text we were discussing, so like that's just my off-the-cuff comments about like the use of the term Father, the difference between a fastened rigid designator and the use of the Psalm 2:7 in Mark 1 as well, which should be read in light of, say, Malachi and the Isaiah texts, where again, I think the best you can do is like divine agency, but not numerical identification of person. So they're my quick off-the-cuff comments based on what you just said.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, those are really great insights, Robert. I will, there's one thing, looking through my Greek New Testament that I did want to point out, and I think, if I said Hebrews 2 and Hebrews chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 are kind of linchpin of modalism. The baptismal scene in Mark is kind of the proof text against modalism. But there is an interesting variant, I think, in the Diatessaron, where it doesn't have phone or even ekuseste, so it doesn't have voice from heaven or he heard a voice from heaven. It just has from heaven. Was this statement, if I'm reading the textual apparatus correct, which would kind of lessen the distinction of persons. So instead of having the voice, the Son, and the Spirit, there would just be this kind of statement from heaven. I mentioned that to say that kind of eases the blow that this verse gives to the modal to the modalist argument.
Yeah, and I will just say in response, not happy she having like say the Tatians, the Atestron right at hand. I do have Ephraim's commentary downstairs, but I would have to look at my Greek of Tatians, the Atestron.
I hate the DSS wrong. It's just I mean
Yeah.
it's historically important, but yes.
I would just say like I'm unaware, having read it like previously, of any evidence that Tatian was a modalist. He seems to like consistently portray the Father and Son as numerical distinction. So
yeah,
if there's like a textual variation here, I don't believe that like it well it's necessary like say either original to the text of Mark or like evidence at least in this case like of a modalist reading. Because like the vice comes from heaven. So it kind of begs the question like who is the originator of this vice? Because again, this vice is from a spatially distinct place than where the baptized Christ is. So even then, it may soften the blow, but I still think there's a blow, if you respectfully speaking, where that there's a distinction because I unless you're saying like the person Christ was engaged in divine ventriloquism from the sky, there's like still the
it's
issue
a tough
where
text.
it's
I mean,
prima facie, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even people when Sibelius was arguing for modalism, people would immediately turn to this text. This is always the text that people drew on to say,
yeah, because it's even if you're biblically illiterate, you're at least familiar with this from like say all the storybooks and stuff like that. So,
so yeah.
Let's see. Do you have any questions for me, or do you want to make any
No.
other comments? Okay. You would agree with like say terms like Father, God, and so forth are what's called flaccid designators. In of itself, they don't have like strict the same reference necessarily. So like one could use the term Father even in Scripture, but that does not necessarily mean as a strict reference to like one person or one thing.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I would also counter that you'd have to look at the lexical usage. So if something is used percentage wise more, then you can kind of make the argument that this may be more of an indicator than something else.
Oh yeah, sure, but like in of itself, it's not rigid. Yeah, that's my question. So
because like you said, I mean Moses is called Theos and
yeah, and there's actually some cases where like he speaks as if he's Yahweh based on the text, like first person. Now I'm sure I'd be surprised if you're not, but like, are you like at least familiar with like say Latter-day Saint theology with respect to say divine investiture and like the 1916 statement?
Yes.
So
that Jesus speaks in the Father's name.
Yeah. So would you at least
that's basically James
Talmage was the main researcher for that. Yeah. No, in fact, he helped with the authorship of it. But would you let's just say for the sake of argument, all instances of Father in like say the Malachi 2 text, like have we not one God, has not one Father created us, or we may have inverted that, like Malachi 2:10 and other like text. Let's just say for the sake of argument, Father there is a reference to God the Father. Would you at least agree that for a Latter-day Saint in and of itself, that's not a problem for our Christology, where we believe the Father and Son are distinct persons, because we do believe
because divine
in a very high view of like say the concept of divine agency.
No,
and that is that's not just like a Latter-day Saint thing, that is actually an ancient Near Eastern concept as well.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine. As I said, I didn't know exactly what text you wanted to bring up, so I'm a little unprepared here for the Q&A. But if you have any other questions, if not, we can actually move on to Psalm 110, verse 1.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Cool. I'm just going to take a quick toilet break, so I will be back. I'll just be 2 minutes.
Some water, so
that's perfect. So no, that's perfect. Cool. So intermission halfway through, so that's good. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Robert, I'm back.
Oh, myself installed. Welcome back. So,
Thanks. I brought my this is like literally a $13
oh,
edition of the Septuagint
nice.
from Amazon. I couldn't afford to get the one I had back when I was in biblical studies, like the $100 one from Bibo Gesellschaft. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, but I have something I can make you jealous. Guess what I have on Logos?
What's that?
The Gotenjin Septuagint, all the volumes.
Oh gosh, yeah. Uh I am kind of I'm actually legit jealous of that.
And everyone in the chat is wondering what the heck is that?
Yeah,
Okay.
when I was in Heidelberg, they had that, and then there was also a translation I absolutely loved of the Septuagint into German. It was called Septuaginta Deutsch.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
and absolutely loved and I love that, but it's like $200-$300 to buy. So not coming home with me.
Yeah, I can see why that can be a bit of a downer. So, okay, let's see. Can you see my screen with like SAM 110 LXX 109?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool. You ready to go for like my round two?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. Okay, awesome. I will start my timer now. Okay, I will be discussing the reception of Psalm 110, verse 1, LXX 109, verse 1 in the New Testament and related literature, where the two lords are actually two distinct persons, they're not one and the same person. The Hebrew of Psalm 110 1 reads, Lada'id mazmod no'um Yahweh ladani shev lamini adashad avavecha adam larecha. I do apologize if I butchered the Hebrew a little bit. And Psalm Septuagint reads, Toda'id samos ibn hokurias to kuriomu katun extaxomu yos antu tos ectrusu epipodion don podonsu. There's no major textual variations in these texts. The only textual issues I know here is like or 6th century omits definite article before kurios. So there's no real distinction. I'm going to argue that in this text, in terms of how it's received, before Dune and after the New Testament, two persons you're both called Lord in Hebrew, Yahweh, and Ladani to my Adon in the Septuagint, two lords or Kyriai, to butcher the Greek a bit, are actually in view here, and they're numerically distinct persons. Alongside Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man passages and other like terms, this is the most quoted and or alluded to text in the entirety of the New Testament. Dan, in his Crystal book on whether early Christians worship Jesus, said this is the golden thread that moves throughout the New Testament, and I would actually agree with him. It's of Christological significance, and I'm sure Adam will agree with me. So, when respect to the intertestamental period, there's a great book by Hayes, published by the SBL, Glory at the Right Hand. I would suggest getting that. The clearest evidence as the second reference non-divine yet real status comes from the paraphrases of Targums. And I do believe like Christ is divine, but like say Jewish interpreters believe that this was a human figure who was numerically distinct from God. Here are some of the how they rendered the psalm. The Lord, i.e. Yahweh, said in his decree to make me Lord of all Israel, but he said, wait till for Saul of the tribe of Benjamin to die, for one reign must not encroach on another, and afterwards I will make your enemies a prop for your feet. Another Targum, the Lord spake by his decree, which is what Na'um means. It's not simply an utterance, but it's a prophetic saying. Yeah. In give me the dominion in exchange for saying in study of Torah, wait on my right hand, I'll make your enemies a prop for your feet. And so on and so forth. In this org, another Targum, the Lord said in his decree to appoint me ruler of Israel, but the Lord said unto me, wait for Israel, Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, pass away from the world, and afterwards you will inherit the kingship, and I will make your enemies a prop for your feet. So this is Messianic, it's about kinship and eschaton in view here, and this is the intertestamental literature. There's one Targum, Psalm 110, verse 1, where Amar Adonai, or Yahweh, to his Memra. I don't know Aramaic, so I will admit I did cheat a bit and queried this translation.
It's basically the same as Logos.
Yeah, exactly. One translation, and I've never formally studied Aramaic, so I did kind of check my translation against ChatGPT, which I know is a bit cheating, so I do apologize. But by David was this praise said, the Lord said by his word, his Memra, to appoint me as ruler over all Israel. However, he said to me again, wait, and I will appoint Saul, who is for the tribe of Benjamin, until his appointed time comes to an end. For no kingdom is brought close to its companion, and afterward I will set your enemies beneath your feet to be subdued under you. And that's from the Sepharia website, which is excellent. So again, like in the intertestamental period, up until this time, in terms of the reception history of this important verse, no one believed that the two lords were the same person. They always distinguished between the two lords as numerically distinct someones or persons. So does the New Testament continue this trend? And I would argue yes. There's New Testament quotes, reference on the first few, that's just notes for myself. Hebrews 1:13, we went through Hebrews 1, but I did stop at verse 12. Hebrews 1:13, but to which of the angels said he at any time, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. So prima facie, there just seemed like a distinction of persons, but also like the spatial location between the two persons after the second exaltation, where they sit on the right hand of the glory on high. A well-known text is Mark 12:28-37, where Christ is asked, whose son is David and so forth. And then he asks the important question, like, if the Messiah is the son of David, how come David said in the Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make an enemy's foot at your feet. So this is of messianic significance. Because as Christ says, quote, for David himself said by the Holy Ghost, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. David therefore called him Lord, Kyrios, and whence is he then his son? And the common people held him gladly. This is like the impossible to answer question because there was the expectation the Messiah would be the son of David, which prima facie would indicate subordination to David. The son of David would, linguistically indicate maybe you're lesser than David. But then why did David, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, say, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand? So again, Christ has identified himself not as the first Lord, and in the Hebrew that's Yahweh, but Ladini, to my Lord, the to Kuryomu of Psalm 109:1, the Septuagint. So again, two persons or two indicicals are in view here. The same when it comes to, say, Acts 2:30-36, which reads, therefore, being a prophet, knowing that God has sworn an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, speaking of David, he would raise up Christ or Messiah to sit on his throne. He's seen this before he spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades or hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. This Jesus had God raised up. So notice, like, even before the quotation of Psalm 110, the Father raises Christ or resurrects him. So this seems to be prima facie, again, numerical distinct persons. One is acted upon, one's active, both are not active, and one's passive, at least in this verse here. And then it quotes Psalm 110, verse 1, applying it to, of course, Christ being the second Lord here. There's another text, and Adam did kind of mention like Stephen's vision of Acts 7:55-56. I think it's generally agreed that at least one of the Old Testament texts that is informing Stephen's vision is Psalm 110, verse 1, where but he, being full of the Holy Ghost, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus Christ standing on the right hand of God. So yes, this is a vision, but at the same time, you have the Father, and then you have who's called the glory of God, and then you have the Son who's on the right hand. And it is true, like the term right hand can mean like right hand man, but this is a vision. He's like reporting what he's seen. He's not discussing like say the rank and investiture of these figures here. So this is like spatial relationship, not like say power relationship, if you will. And said, behold, I see the heavens open at the Son of Man, Daniel 7, standing on the right hand of God. So again, two numerical distinct persons are in view here. And when it comes to, say, 1 Corinthians 15:22-28, this is like for lack of a midrash, if you will, or prophetic expansion upon Psalm 110, verse 1. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive, but every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterwards they that are Christ's, that he's coming. Then come at the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power, for he must reign till he hath put all enemies under his feet, which is harkened back to the until or the haos of Psalm 110, verse 1. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death, for he hath put all things under his feet. But when he saith all things are put under him, it is manifest that he is expected, which did put all things under him. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. So in this like expansion, if you will, of Psalm 110, verse 1, discussing the eschaton, Christ will rule until he hands the reins over to the Father. And all throughout this pericope, this passage, there's a distinction between the Father and the Son. The Father does stuff that the Son does not do, and vice versa. Again, two persons are in view here, and there's like a reference here to Psalm 110 as well, which is important for its reception history. And of course, like when you look at, say, how this is received in the early apostolic fathers, the patristic data is important, especially if you look at the earliest. As Gillingham noted in her book on Psalms through the centuries, as early as the Epistle of Barnabas, which is quoted here, 12:10-12, Psalm 110:1 is used to demonstrate that Jesus is Messiah, not as Son of David, but as Son of God, whom David calls Lord. Similarly, Justin, martyr in Dialogue 32:6, reads the whole psalm in light of Jesus as God, and so forth. but even like if you look at this, and I'll just scroll for the time, Justin Martyr, who's one of my favorite patristic authors, dialogue with Traveler 32. To clarify this matter further for you, I shall cite other passages from the Blessed David, from which you can see that Christ is also called Lord by the Holy Prophetic Spirit, and that God, the Father of all, raised him from the earth and placed him at his right hand until he makes his enemies his footstool, which indeed actually happened when our Lord Jesus Christ ascended into heaven after his resurrection from the dead. So it's just the intertestamental literature. There's no indication I'm aware of that Psalm 110:1, which he's quoted all throughout the New Testament and alluded to as well throughout Hebrews, for instance, which according to Buchanan is like an expansion on just Psalm 110 verse 1 alone, that there's a identification of the two Kuriai lords as the same person. There's always a distinction in spite of the early high logos Christology of Justin. And just to end on this, like even if you look at medieval commentaries as well from Jewish rabbis who are working with the Hebrew and Aramaic, again, they always understood two distinct persons are in view. And I'll just end here with Rashi in his commentary on Psalm 110:1. The word of Lord to my master, or rabbis interpreted it as referring to Abraham, or father, and I shall explain it according to their words, Midrash, Psalm 110:1. The word of our Lord to Abraham, whom the world called my master, as it is written in Genesis 23:6, hearken to us, my master. So again, when one looks at the intertestamental literature, which is the Sitz and Laban of the Greek New Testament, one looks at the New Testament itself, and afterwards, like in the early patristic data and so on, there's no indication that any of these commentaries, until modalism arose, of course, that these two lords were actually the same person. They were always understood as being numerically distinct persons, in spite of the debate as to who the second lord was. So I'll let stop here. But yeah, so that's my opening. So I'll let you.
Yeah. Really good points, Robert. Always glad to draw on the history of interpretation. Like I said, my failed PhD was on the history of interpretation of the Book of Job. So history of interpretation is important. I think that context is also important as to why we get these readings of Psalm 110 in the history of interpretation. I find it interesting that the Septuagint version uses kurios twice, whereas, like you said, in the Hebrew, you have Yod He Vav He, and then you have Adon, which can just be Lord, Master, and it's usually just for a generic human person. So that, to me, I would say that the Septuagint, over and above the MT, facilitates kind of a modalistic reasoning, because better facilitates a modalistic reading because you have kurios used for both of the figures over and above the actual Hebrew text. Just the observation I'm making. Secondly, when you talk about the intertestamental period, or I refer to it as Second Temple Judaism, I used to say intertestamental amongst biblical scholars. They would always get mad at me because there's no intertestament. You know, if you include the Apocrypha, it's all just the one Bible. I like intertestamental, but I'll say Second Temple Judaism. With the Targums, you have, especially after the time of Second Isaiah, and you get into Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Second Temple, etc. There is a pushback from having any kind of dualistic language associated with God. So it makes sense in the Targums, and that's where you get the Memra from. The Memra is just basically another example of Malak Adonai, how to talk about God without saying God. That's why you have the Memra in the Targums in the first place, because they want to kind of downplay this language of any type of dualism within the Godhead, because that for them comes very close to what the heathen nations are doing. So the Aramaic Targums in particular try to overemphasize monotheism by kind of reducing some of the language, this like I said, this dualism that you get in the Septuagint and in the MT itself. One last thing with Acts chapter 7 with the Stephen theophany. I think you're absolutely correct. It's drawing on Psalm beginning of Psalm 110. I would say here that right hand, yes, it's often interpreted as spatial. I think that's a status thing because the Messiah is always said exactly in Psalm 10 as the one who will be on the right hand. We get this language in the book of Daniel as well. So I think that's a status thing. And if we understand it as a status thing, we're not talking about two entities that are spatially apart from one another, but you have the glory of God, aka the Shekinah, the embodiment of God as understood in the Old Testament, and you have the human Jesus, God the Son, in the humanity of Jesus. And Stephen sees all this because he's just been stoned and he's dead, and so he sees the full totality of God in this vision as he's dying. If that makes sense. That's all I have to say about that.
Let's see. Okay, well, I have a few questions. I'm sure you have a few questions for me. So, because it's my section, I'll start. Okay, you mentioned the Targums, and you mentioned like how after time of Ezra, there was like a move away from dualistic language, and that's how the Memra came about in like say the Targums and so forth. Do you have any evidence? Like, I'm guessing like you would believe like this would represent a false tradition that muddied the waters,
yes.
if you will.
Yeah.
So
this, yeah.
Yeah. No, I just want to make sure so I'm not misunderstanding you. Do you have any positive evidence that this idea was actually being subverted by the authors of the New Testament?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think,
because there are like various traditions that were floating about at the time that the biblical authors are subverting.
I think just the New Testament understanding, and like you said, I think you hit the nail on the head with even as early as Mark and in Paul's letters, just of understanding of Jesus as God. If we take that, identifying as the Father or anything, is kind of pushing back on this. I would use that as an example.
I'm trying to be nice here, but would you agree with me that is basically begging the question, like you're assuming the end of the debate, i.e., that when they use the term chaos and other high language, you're assuming modalism. That's like them subverting it, but like of course, like I don't believe that's the case. So like prescinding from assuming the end of the debate, if you will, do you have outside this, like, do you have any other evidence that they're actually trying to subvert this, what you would view to be an errant tradition that came about after time of Ezra and is exemplified in the Memra traditions in the Targums?
That's a great question. It's something I honestly haven't thought about.
Fair enough.
Much, Robert. Yeah.
That's what I'll let you ask a question if you want. I have a few prepared here.
Oh no, that's it. Yeah, no other questions.
Okay. You mentioned Acts 7:55 to 56. You would agree with that there are some instances where the term right hand can refer to like a spatial location, like Zechariah 1:3, like these Satan figures on the right hand of Yahweh and so forth. Yeah.
Yes, I would concede that point, but I would also say that when it's used messianically, I think this is referring to the status of whoever this messianic figure is, and for us.
And I would argue like it doesn't have to be like a false like I'll make people end, but just make a question of this. What Acts is like historical narrative, and what Luke is doing when he's writing this narrative, he's actually recording what Stephen sees in the vision. Yeah. So I think we're both in concert so far. So he's not Luke describing what Stephen is seeing in a vision, and like using just like the basic, and we both know like the normal rules of exegesis. You approach a text like based on its literary genre, here historical narrative.
But he's also quoting what Stephen's saying. So Stephen's saying, "Behold, I see the glory of God and I see the Son of Man."
Yes, and Stephen is recording what he's seen in a vision. So beyond like say assuming what's in view here, namely that right hand refers like only positional, not spatial, if you will, is not like just like at least prima facie it being a historical narrative. And also like the use of say Daniel 7, Psalm 110, where these are visions of like one figure being spatially, not simply like in terms of power relationship on the right hand, if you will, of another. It would at least indicate like say there is some kind of numerical distinction, at least in terms of spatial relationship here.
I'd give you that. Yeah, I do think I would push back on Daniel 7. I think it's a Daniel 7. I think it's a positional status thingy, but that's just my opinion. That's just my view.
Yeah, but I think we would agree. Like we both hold minority interpretations of the Ancient One or Ancient of Daisies. I believe you think it's John the Baptist. I think it's Michael/Adam. But again, I would just say like it doesn't have to be like either or; it could be both and. But you would agree with me that at least Psalm 110 is like one of the texts that's undergirding, if you will, at the record of Stephen's vision, Acts
Yes,
7:55,
absolutely.
56.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And maybe I just like ask this, like in ancient Near Eastern culture, and this is like Psalm 110 is like, of course, informed like say ancient Near Eastern kinship and so forth. The vizier of the ultimate king would always be like the right
That's
hand
right.
man, if you will, and so forth. So
It's
would
both because he's literally at his right side, but he's also he's your right hand. He's the guy who it's his position. It's a title though as well. I mean, I'm trying to say.
yeah, and that would fit my both hand as opposed to either or idea. But be that as may, like, are you familiar with like say any interpretation of this verse? Personally from like the New Testament, like say the intertestamental literature, Second Temple Jewish literature, if you prefer that term, I don't mind either way, or any early patristic literature that would identify the two lords as the same person. Are you familiar with any? Because like there is like literature by say Jewish interpreters where they think it may be David and maybe Abraham and maybe some other patriarchal figure. They never identify it with the second figure as the same person as God.
Yeah. I don't know of any. I don't know of any. Yeah. I don't think there are any. It would be interesting. I wish that the Apostolic Fathers probably had actually quoted this verse. I know you mentioned Justin Martyr, and I think he's probably the earliest dude that we have.
Oh, there's also like the Epistle of Barnabas. If you want, I'll just
Barnabas
quote.
Testament. Yeah.
Yeah, it's chapter 10, 12, 10 to 12, and I'll just quote it. And this is like from the which series is this? Ancient Christian Writer series. Behold, there is Jesus again, not the Son of Man, but the Son of God, though revealed by a type in the flesh. Now they were going to say that Christ was the Son of David, and so David himself, fearing and comprehending the error of the sinners, prophesied. The Lord said, "My Lord, be thou seated in my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet." And again, Isaiah says as follows: "The Lord said to Christ, my Lord, whose right hand I uphold, the nations are to obey him, and I will shatter the might of kings." Now, how David calls him Lord and does not call him Son. So it's kind of Barnabas is harkening back to say the incident in Mark 12, where Christ is asked like if the Messiah been the son of David and all that jazz.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how you date Barnabas, but I think like late first, early mid second century. I think
Yeah. I'd say late first century. I'm dating pretty early.
Yeah, it's after the destruction of the Second Temple, at least, though. But yeah, do you have no other comments or questions, so we can actually move on to like your final? Okay, well, we're actually making the time. I think we can actually get the full 3 rounds done. So we will now go on to your round 3. Do you have any biblical passage you want me to open up in the parallel window, or?
You know what? We went through every single. I have my little notes here. We went through every single passage I wanted to look at, except for 1 Corinthians 8, 4-6. And for that one, I kind of wanted to just get your point of view, because this is another one, just like with the baptismal event in Mark. This is another. This is one that kind of throws modalist off. I did have 1 Timothy 2:5 as well. And I think there is something interesting going on there. Actually, let me go. Can we do 1 Timothy 2:5?
Yeah, sure. Let me just pop up the text here. Of course, this is the well-known there's one mediator text, but yeah. KJV and NRSV.
Yeah, let me pull it up too. Hold on. Bear with me.
Oh, sure, you're good. Take your time.
So I actually have an interesting rendering of that verse based on kind of what you get both in Greek and in Latin. So eis gartheos, eis kai mesistes theou, kai anthropos, Christos Jesus. So you have hold on just a second. So you have kai here. So you have eis kai mesistes theou, kai anthropon. And one of interesting that when you have kai together, it can be both and if you do that, so traditional translation, I'll just have your our listeners look at the English text in the KJVs. For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. I would render that. I have a little bit of a different rendering for that. So I would say there's both one God, one mediator between God and men, Jesus Christ. So I think in rendering, if we do the kai kai or et as in Latin, if we do that, then that kind of lessens the distinction. So the one God refers to the man Jesus Christ. So one God, comma, one mediator between God, also one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. So I take the one God there as ultimately referring to Christ Jesus. And if we look at the NRSV and the New American Bible, they kind of take it somewhat like that as well. So where's the NRSV? Hold on. I have my other New Testament here, my parallel New Testament. Give me just a sec. So yeah, so for example, the New American Standard Bible, they have the and in kind of quote in italics, suggesting that you don't have to translate that. So there's one God, one mediator also between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. And then the New Revised has there is one God, there is also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus himself, human. So both of those both of those, I think their rendering of the verse, one is more accurate and two suggest that the one God here is actually a reference to Jesus Christ. So not one mediator, one God and one mediator as a separate person, but that we're referring to one God is the one who is also a mediator between God and men. I don't know if I made sense or confused the heck out of everybody. But that's my my 2 cents worth on 1 Timothy 2:5.
Do you want to make some comments about 1 Corinthians 8?
Yeah, so couple of things. So I mentioned before that I think you have kurios hatheos. So you have the kurios here, which refers to Jesus. I would argue, which refers, from a modalistic perspective, refers to kind of the human Jesus, God the Son as Lord, and then the hatheos as referring to the divinity of Jesus, the divine nature of Jesus as God the Father. Now, there's a very interesting thing at the end of this verse. Let me pull it up. How it's traditionally been rendered. So verse 6, Al-Himun, Al-Humin, et is theas hapater ex u tapanta, kai hemes, et is autan, kai et is kurias Jesus Christos, di u tapanta, kai emes di autu. But for us, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and we through him. Now, the Greek phrasing, except for et is auton, it uses diauton later on in the verse. Basically, it's almost exactly the same in describing the actions of Jesus and describing the actions of Jesus Christ and of God the Father. And it's interesting because in John 5:21, to do some intertextual stuff here, the Father is the one who is said to bring life to everybody, but here Jesus is said to be the one who is through whom all things are. So It's interesting here that both the Greek phrasing is somewhat similar, and Jesus and God the Father are kind of being described as doing the same things, which from a modalist perspective suggests an identification, a direct identification between the both of them. So that's all I have to, that's basically all I have to say about that.
Okay, well, I will make some off-the-cuff comments, and then we're going to go through the Q&A. So, okay, I'll start where you started. Timer's not. I'll start where you started, 1 Timothy 2. The context, of course, is like mediation of Christians for other believers. So that's the context in which we have to place. There's a numerical distinction between the people you mediate for as a Christian. Where it says like, I exhort therefore the first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, all godliness and honesty. For this is a good and acceptable in sight of God our Savior, who will all men to be saved and to come to knowledge of the truth. So, of course, the immediate context of this pericope is, of course, like Paul telling people, the Christians to actually pray for all people, including those in power, so that Christians may have a peaceable life. And we all know how that went. But this is where like we kind of get there is one mediator, mestasis. And the term mestasis, I'm unaware, and maybe you might be of any instance where mestasis is used in a reflexive way that's required for the modalist reading. Proceeding from like this verse, mestasis is used, for instance, in Galatians with respect to like Moses being the intercessor, harkening back to Exodus 32 to 33, where Moses intercedes before God, who, according to the original language texts, does change his mind after being red hot angry, and that he was a successful, albeit not perfect, mediator, and Christ, of course, being the ultimate mestasis, mediator, and intercessor, something we'll be discussing momentarily in my next section. And who Christ gave himself as a ransom for all to be testified in due time. And this will be going into like the atonement, high priestly intercession material. But how does that work if they're numerically one same person? The normative function of mestasis in biblical Greek is someone who's different than the person that they intercede before. A mediator has to be a different person than the person who is the reception, if you will, of the mediation. In this case, the lutron or ransom. That is Christ's atoning sacrifice. We'll discuss that momentarily. Also, throughout Paul's letters, including the pastoral epistles, which I believe he did write, theos is used almost exhaustively for the person of the Father. So the term, we have one God, theos, that harkens back to the person of the Father. And I would have to look into like the kai thing, and that if that purples Greek et, but just based on my reading of the text, there seems to be a distinction between the God here, the theos, and the mestasis, who is in the category of anthropos. So, there's some issues here. Now, with respect to 1 Corinthians 8, 4-6, this is like a very rich text, and it's very important. I believe that Paul is expanding, not splitting the Shema, the Deuteronomy 6:4, and there's a host of other issues as well, but that there seems to be like a distinction between theos and kurios in terms of person can actually be seen in verse 6. Verse 6, the King James reads, "But there is but one God, Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom I should say, are all things, and we by him." Now, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, creation is said to be ek, from the Father, while it's said to be dia, true, by the Son.
Yeah.
Now, there's like a few issues. This is parallel to like Romans 11 with respect to these prepositions in creation. Now, if one wants to like take an all or nothing view of this pericope in a way that some wish to, using logic, you can actually show like there's a distinction between Jesus and the Father. First premise, if Jesus is God in the sense, a modalist sense, all things would be made from ek, him. Second premise, all things were not made from ek, Jesus. They're made ek, the Father, through dia, the Son. Conclusion, Jesus is not God in the modalist understanding, i.e. he's not the person of the Father. And this is actually perfectly logical reasons called modus tollens. So just like simply like applying like basic logic to this pericope, it does seem to be, in spite of like the very lofty title of kurios that's used of Jesus. And yes, it is true, like that's often the name of deity in the Old Testament. We can maybe discuss that momentarily, how it's been functioning vis-a-vis Christ, and so forth. Again, there doesn't be a numerical distinction between the person of God the Father and the Son, even in these creation texts as well. So there are my brief statements just based on that. So yeah.
I want to modify my one argument. So I meant to say, so the kai the both and will not work here. I meant to say the first chi, the one after et is, can be even, can be translated as even or also.
Okay.
So one for one God, for there's one God, even one mediator of God between God and men, the man Jesus Christ, or all who taking it this way, who is also who is even the one mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. So connecting theos with Christos Jesus. Mesistes, that's a very good point. That Mesistes is usually the mediator has to be different than the person, but I think that would go back, and you mentioned this before too, like atonement theology. Who is able to be the mediator between God and man? It can't. It has to be in traditional Christian theology. It has to be God. God.
Okay, Athanasius.
Yes. But yeah, that's something that we can talk about some.
Yeah. But just on the issue, like say, because we're on 1 Timothy 2, not necessarily to like shift, like say, atonement, but it's kind of inevitable if you bring up the idea of like say Christ as mediator. You would agree, like say, where Paul uses the term elsewhere in these epistles, like he uses Moses. Of course, like Moses is not numerically the same person as God, and he's called Messias in Galatians. Are you aware of any instance in either the Greek New Testament specifically, or like the LXX, or like the any of the kind of Greek manuscripts or textual traditions within that kind of time period as well, where the term messias is used in like a reflexive way, like you mediate for one person mediates to themselves, if you will, or to butcher the Greek thing, messias themselves, if you will.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever used in the reflexive. I had to check on that. I'm curious to what the going outside, also looking at classical Greek, what examples there might be of that. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure. I don't think so. In your defense, I don't think so, but I'm curious to see that.
So, presenting for like say the even and construction you're arguing here, do you have any like indication, without like assuming what's in debate here, like i.e. modalism, that the term here, theos and messias, are indexicals or reference to the same person, namely like when he says like Iskar theos, kai messias, teu kai anthropos
Well, they're
Christos
both.
Jesus.
I mean, they're both in the nom. I mean, they're both nominative, so you could technically. I mean, my point was that the chi after eis can just be even or all. Well, so also, um, instead of what traditional translations do, like the King James say, there is one God and one mediator between God and men. You could say, if you translate the chi as also or even, then that could imply the sense that the mesistes is the same as the theos. Grammatically, they agree with each other, but it depends on how you translate the chi there.
Okay. Again, this I don't want to like bring in my next topic into this vis-a-vis like neutron and stuff like that. So maybe I'll just like leave it there. But if you have any questions for me,
no, it's all good.
Okay, cool. Okay. All we're actually making good time.
Yeah. That's actually those are, I think we've gone through all of the scriptures I actually want to touch on.
No, that is perfect. Okay, what I'm going to do is like I'm going to share my screen, but there's only like 3 texts, so I'm not going to do a parallel window, but I'll just make some brief comments and we can take it from there.
Okay.
Okay, I will start my timer now. Okay, this next section will not be focused on a specific text, but it will be on the theme, namely Christ as heavenly mediator. Which is why I didn't really have too many questions about 1 Timothy 2, because I didn't want to like move or bleed into like this particular section. So we are both agreed that one of the types of Christ is like the high priest who would make intercession before God in the tabernacle and so forth. And for the atoning sacrifice in the old covenant to be efficacious, it required this intercession. In the same way, like for the resurrection and intercession of Christ makes his atonement effectual, instrumentally and so forth. So with that as a background, one of the most important texts, and this kind of goes back to Johannine literature that we started off with, the following is said by John: "My little children, these things write I unto you, that ye sin not. And if any man sin, we have an advocate," and that's the term parakletos, "with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, the dikaios. And he, Christ, is the propitiation for our sins." And there's a debate as to like how to translate this. I'm not going to go into it because it's not relevant for the issue of like, are they the same person or not? But that's the term hilasmos. And not for our sins only, but also for the sins of the whole world. Christ is actually presented as this like figure of like intercession and mediation, and it's in the present tense. But this kind of breaks down as like, how do you actually either placate or expiate if you're actually the sins of people, if you're not the recipient, if you're also the same person as the recipient of this divine suiting, if you will. That's the issue. I just would argue that this does not really fit the type-anti-type relationship. Yes, the anti-type, that is the fulfillment of the type, is always greater than the Old Testament prefigurement of the type. But there's also important substantial similarities. And how does that work here if in the Old Covenant, the priest, who's not the same person as the person that he's interceding before, suits, albeit imperfectly, God's wrath? How does that work here with respect to Jesus, who is the atoning sacrifice, the hilasmos, if you will? This kind of goes back to, like, say, the throne scene that John of the Apocalypse sees. And of course, this is like a vision. One has to be a bit careful, but kind of knows, like, say, how there's a spatial distinction between the Father and the Lamb, who's seen as this intercessory figure as well. It says, "And one of the elders said unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne of the 4 beasts, and the midst of the elders, stood a lamb, as if had been slain." And this is very graphic. The Greek actually indicates like as if it had its throat cut, like the Passover lamb. Yeah, exactly. "Having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth unto all the earth." And of course, like later in this passage, he is actually before the throne of God. He's not actually on the throne of God himself. So there's going to be like a distinction. But this is emphasizing this part of his intercessory, heavenly mediatorial role. Something that's mentioned as well in Hebrews, where it says like, he holds the priest of Melchizedek, aparapatos, inviolate, and he lives to make intercession. To whom is he interceding? That's the issue we have to address. One other text, let me just like one other text as well, which kind of harkens back to, of course, the Hebrews 7 text that speaks of the intercession of Christ. Actually, second last one. "Therefore he, Christ, had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a faithful, merciful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement." That's hilaskatai, the present infinitive of hilasmos. He's making intercession. He's making propitiation. To whom is he actually at this moment making intercession or propitiation to? For the sins of the people. And one other text as well that speaks of the intercessory work of Christ and how it's efficacious and it soothes God's wrath, if you will, if you hold to the propitiation view, and if you hold to the expiation view, covers the sins of God's people. Again, it doesn't really matter how you want to translate or understand that here. As long as I'm just arguing either way, even if you follow C.H. Dodd in following expiation of propitiation, 2 different parties are in view here. It is the text in Romans 8:33 onwards that speaks of the intercessory work of Christ. But no, it's like there's a distinction between God and Jesus. It's because of Christ's intercession, how nothing external to us can actually take us away from God's salvific love. And I'll end here. "Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us." Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, right hand of God here is not simply about spatial relationship. It just seems that Christ is the vizier of God, or you want to understand, like in some type of authority only sense. He's actually making intercession before God in this passage, and it's because of this: "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, and persecution, and so forth?" And Paul goes on saying that there's nothing external to us that can take us away from God's salvific love. Of course, Paul is not teaching like OSAS or Perseverance of Saints. We can actually take us away from God's salvific love, but because it's grounded on the intercessory work of Christ, who is the present tense hilasmos, hilaskatai, if you will, from Hebrews 2:17, and he's a high priest who is the ultimate anti-type or fulfillment of the Old Testament type of the priest on the Day of Atonement and so forth. that we can actually be assured that our future sins will be forgiven if we repent. So there's issues here like how can you intercede to yourself? And yes, the text in Revelation is like a apocalyptic literature, but there's still theology that can be still produced from apocalyptic visions and so forth, where Christ actually is presented as the Passover lamb. He has his throat cut. The Greek is very, very graphic there, as Adam can attest. And yet later in that throne room scene, there's a distinction between the lamb who's before the throne of God, which highlights again, emphasizes he sits down because he's atoned. He's finished. It's once for all. It's complete, if you will. But the application requires his ongoing priestly intercession as well to ensure that it's ongoing application. So there's like a host of atonement issues which we'll definitely address in the Q&A section. But these are some issues that I would argue requires on great theological grounds, i.e., the atonement and Christ's intercession, and he's been the fulfillment of all these Old Testament types. That requires him that he has to be numerically distinct from the person to whom he intercedes. He's not interceding to himself. It's not reflexive action. It's, as with the Old Testament priest, something that's done to another person. So all in there, but they're my brief comments on the topic.
Thanks for that, Robert. Yeah, very good references. I did find for Mesistes, there is a classical reference meaning from Apollonius, yes. Discalus, meaning stakeholder. So basically the stake you put in the tent that holds everything together. But if we took Mesistes as that, then, that theologically, this is a stretch, I admit that, that might make more sense to describe. So God is the one who holds everything together, but that's not attested to at all in ecclesiastical Greek, and there's no church father, and there's nowhere in the New Testament where Mesistes is understood in that regard.
Oh, do you want to address say what I just said, or do you have any comments on that, or do you want to move on to Q&A?
I mean, my only comment is basically, as I mentioned before, I guess from a modalist understanding, the sin that has to be atoned for on the part of humanity is so great that only God can atone for that sin. But I mean, that's something that you believe anyway, in your understanding of the Godhead. So, but
well, and to be fair, it's explicating our unique acceptance of the Book of Mormon. But,
yeah. So
for sure, acceptance.
Yeah, no comments.
Okay, I'll just have to think of some questions on the fly. I'm sure you have others as well. You would agree with me that, say, there is a type-anti-type relationship between the Old Testament priests who would intercede and make the atonement actualized, if you will, on the Day of Atonement and other sacrifices, and with the presentation of Christ as intercessor and high priest in heaven. Would you agree or disagree that there's a type-anti-type relationship between these two elements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Epistle of Hebrews points that out very well.
Okay. So is it more say your assumption that for the atonement to be how the Bible presents it requires a divine person, that divine person has to be the person of God and Father to actually make the atonement?
Yeah, I would say that it's a different, what Jesus does has the parallel with the priest in the Old Testament, but also because of the nature of what exactly he's atoning for, it has to be different. There has to be some type of divine figure involved. Because remember for in the Old Testament, that priest, and the author of Hebrews touches on this as well, but the priest is atoning for kind of unintentional, in large part for unintentional sin. So it's a different type. So there's a parallel, but there's also a difference in what needs to be fixed, basically.
Okay. I got a weird message from some guy. Okay. I'll let you ask a question and then I'll do a follow-up.
Yeah, I'm no questions on my part.
Okay, no, I just some guy called Take Up New Styles. That's kind of a Protestant, but it seems like he's LDS. So, no, okay. Let me just say, I would agree with you. A divine person had to make the atonement. That's like explained in the Book of Mormon, so it's not unique to Athanasius. But
Trinitarians would agree with that as well. So
yeah,
yeah.
so I would just argue though, my theology allows for an accommodation of both like that, but also a distinction of the person of this father and son. So like how how do you understand like the I know we kind of addressed this like in part two of our debate last a year plus ago, but how do you understand the dynamics of the atonement? Like who is being propitiated, appeased, if you will, by the atonement, and who is the how do you understand like say the intersection? Because
the humanity of Jesus is appeasing the divinity of Jesus. So going back to kind of that modalism dynamic, that's how I would understand it. I think that's how my church would understand it.
okay, so a person in my view, and I'll make a correction to this, like in my view, a person is being placated, namely God the Father. But and that person is being placated even now by the intercessory work of Christ. But how would it be fair to say, and feel free to correct me, in light of this kind of distinction you're making between, like, say, the humanity, which is Christ, and the divinity, which is the Father, how is a person in the normative understanding of the term being actually placated, or do you believe just like the divinity is being placated by the human nature?
I think I think the with my understanding of modalism, the divinity is being placated by the human nature. That's exactly how I would describe it.
Okay, so but a person, according to the biblical accounts, it's a person who intercedes in the old covenant, and it seems to be at least prima facie a person is interceding in the new covenant. Is that correct? So, how do you understand, like, say, the ongoing intercessory work that's spoken about throughout the resurrection narrative? The text speaking about the resurrected Christ in the New Testament, like in Hebrews, Romans, and texts like that speak about him like a an intercessor, a parakletos, and so forth, like the First John 2 text.
Yeah,
how do you understand like how that works?
Yeah, I haven't thought through it too much. I think that from a modalist perspective, especially this perspective of my particular church tradition, it is the intercession that Christ does on the cross that we emphasize. But you're right, in the New Testament witness, there is intercession going on even after the crucifixion event. So, but that's not something that we've really kind of talked about or thought out within my tradition or as a modalist.
Yeah, I'll just make this statement and feel free to like respond to it. But it's just would seem like say at least prima facie, especially like the type, anti-type, and other issues as well. It's one person interceding before another. And I would argue, especially in light, say, the throne room scene from Revelation. Yes, that's apocalyptic literature, but the Lamb is before figures on the throne. And even though it's apocalyptic literature and so forth, it does seem to be like two distinct persons, and one person is before the other, showing that they're showing their Passover sacrifice, if you will. Of course, the lamb with the throat cut, and as having been slain per the Greek before someone else. And I would just argue that would indicate like two different persons, not simply
yeah, the Agnes in Latin, I don't know, I'm blanking on the term in Greek, sadly, would be we would see that, we would read that as a reference to the humanity of Jesus. But yes, if you're taking the lamb and the throne as two separate, separate figures, that does seem to imply two distinct personages. Yes.
Actually, I should ask this because like a lot of your theology, I think you would agree, like hinges on there being like say the human the human element of Jesus and the divine aspect, which is the Father. If I didn't phrase that correctly.
That's correct. Yeah.
Are you aware like any explicit depiction of this concept in the New Testament, where there's like the biblical author, the New Testament author, just beyond focusing on the New Testament, kind of depicts there being like say this kind of a human element which is called Jesus, and this divine element which is the Father in the one reference or the one indexical? Or do you think that's something that's be read in, if you will?
Yeah, I think, and again, I think Trinitarians would say this as well. This is a way that, so modalism, the primary goal of it is to preserve what we believe to be the monotheism of the Abrahamic tradition, that there is one God. And we believe that Trinitarianism violates that, messes it up by making God three different persons. So we speak of kind of the humanity of Jesus versus the divinity of Jesus, as a way of kind of explaining what we see in the New Testament as affirming the unity of God that you have in the Hebrew Bible. So when I talk about when I use the phrase humanity of Jesus, divinity of Jesus, that's not those terms aren't explicitly referenced in the New Testament, but we believe that the way that Christ that Jesus is described, that God the Father is described in the New Testament, facilitates that type of language, if that makes
So,
sense.
so would it be fair to say, like, say, one of the assumptions that's undergirding this is an assumption that the Old Testament and related to that, because of continuity, the New Testament authors held to a type of strict Unitarian understanding of monotheism?
Yes.
Okay, and I, of course, I would disagree with that. So,
Yeah, and I mean, if from a biblical studies perspective, we see kind of henotheism, then Second Isaiah, the strict monotheism, and then whatever the heck is going on in kind of the early intertestamental period and stuff like that. So, but from a modalistic perspective, we would say that the unity of God is something that's affirmed throughout Scripture. And I think we would argue that in those places where you have henotheism, like the Council of the Gods and stuff in Job like that, that might even be, we might even refer to that as kind of a breaking away, a apostasy from the tradition.
okay, well, hopefully we can actually have a next round later this year where we discuss the Hebrew and Septuagint and
Yeah,
whether it teaches Unitarianism or not. So, yeah. But yeah, no, that's me. So, like, any other comments you want to make, or before we wrap things up?
I think that's it. I think that's it.
That is perfect. Okay, well, we've actually, funny enough, we actually managed to get this done in one take, so that's good. So we don't have to do a part two. Part two can be the Hebrew Bible / Septuagint. Although, because that's a huge text, we have to see what particular topics we want to discuss. But yeah, what we'll do is, like, if you want to take like maybe just like 5 minutes as the closing wrap up, and then we can actually just tell people where they can find us and so forth. So I'll let you take like 5 minutes to make any final general overarching statements, if you will.
Yeah, so basically, what I've argued is that the New Testament, and in many respects, the New Testament is written by people who are trying to understand God. But modalists such as myself, we think that the best way that to describe how God is being understood, how God is being depicted in the New Testament, is through a modalistic lens. So we, like I said, Jesus is God. The divinity of Jesus represents God the Father, and the humanity of Jesus represents God the Son. And we look at, and we know that there are certain passages that are problematic for this, the baptism story in Mark, 1 Corinthians 8, etc. But we also think that there are passages that very strongly support this. Hebrews chapter 1, where there seems to be a direct identification, at least in our understanding of the passage, with between Jesus and God the Father, and many of the statements in the Gospel of John, talking about the oneness of Jesus with the Father and of knowing and seeing Jesus in both of those Greek terms suggests a direct identification between Jesus and God the Father, though, as Robert noted, there's also some problematic issues with those verses as well. So that's about all I have to say about modalism in the New Testament. If you're interested, I'm on Facebook. You can friend me on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram, Adam the Giant Guy, which is, and I have that name from a whole different subject. I'm a whole different subject entirely from this one, based on understandings of where the Book of Mormon took place. So that's a whole nother topic for another time. But I am on Instagram, and I also have publications, like I mentioned before, on various LDS scriptures and text in Interpreter, Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, BYU Quarterly, and Element.
Let me just do this briefly. Okay, I will start now. Well, before I begin, thanks, Anne, for a really cordial discussion. As with the other previous two, I think it was really informative and it was fun. So I look forward to when we kind of do a follow up on the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint. But okay, so as I said, like obviously my views, like the New Testament as with restoration of scriptures does not teach modalism. I do believe a very good case can be made, and I think has been made today, that the Father and Son, in spite of like the very lofty titles the Son has and so forth, his prerogatives and so forth, they are numerically distinct persons in the same way myself and my good friend Adam are numerically distinct persons, although we have a lot in common here. You know, for instance, sure, nerdiness. But just like to recap, I would argue, especially if you're going to go through, like, say, the text I focused on, like Hebrews 1, where Christ is presented as this kind of hyper-glorified person and so forth, or even the Carmen Christi of Philippians 2, 6 to 11, an early Christological hymn, that in spite of the hyper-exalted status of the Lord Jesus at this very moment in time and so forth, he is still a numerically distinct person from God. You see this, for instance, in Hebrews, where Christ is theos, but in a subordinate sense to theos, that is the Father, especially in light of the use of the Old Testament, such as Psalm 45, which is a coronation hymn in its original context, which was said of the Davidic king, and he, of course, was numerically distinct from the God who anointed him. And in the same way, Christ is numerically distinct from theos, who anoints him. The same when it comes to, say, the language of Hebrews 1, 10 to 12, which is a quotation from the book of Psalms. But if you look at the Septuagint, which I pointed out, the Septuagint understands it as a conversation between God and the person he answers, as opposed to the Masoretic text, God and the person he afflicts. So it's part of a conversation, if you will, where the Father is addressing a numerically distinct person and so forth. There's a lot more one could actually say about that particular topic. I think it's the death knell to Socinianism, but more about that maybe on a later stage. You also see this throughout the Gospels. Again, very important Old Testament texts are used, but I would argue Latter-day Saints, unlike many other traditions, actually have the advantage because it's part of our theology that Christ is the ultimate vizier or ultimate agent, if you will, in light of our theology of divine investiture that was explicated by the First Presidency back in June of 1916. And everyone should read the First Presidency statement on the relationship between the Father and Son, especially because James Talmage was absolutely based and awesome, was the primary author of that text. So there's no issue when it comes to, say, various texts as use of the, even if they are used, of the person of the Father being applied to the person of Christ in the New Testament, because we do have the idea like agentival Christology, while not actually having a Unitarian Christology like Socinians do. We actually do have, I think, especially because of our theology of creation, we can actually have a Christology that encompasses all things and not some like Trinitarian groups and other groups struggle with. We can have a Unitarian Christology because we don't believe there's a species differentiation, but also we can actually have this high exalted Christology as well, and so forth. So I think this is one of the advantages that at least the mainstream of the LDS restorationist tradition has, and I've discussed this quite a bit on my blog, as has my friend Blake Oster, who I think you've read a bit as well.
Yep.
And shout out to Blake, he's great.
Blake. Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the end. But as I said, like for those who want to like reach out to me, scripturalmormonism@gmail.com, follow my blog, follow the podcast, like, share. But yeah, hopefully this has been informative. And definitely, if you're interested in this debate, definitely do check out the previous two where we discussed the Book of Mormon, Book of Moses, the lectures on Fate, and the 1832 First Vision account of the JST, and other issues as well. And we address the question of whether the Book of Mormon, other restorationist texts and scriptures teach modalism. And I would argue no, and Adam argued yes. So yeah, looking forward to like future podcasts with you and other interactions in both for and with one another and against one another in the future fora as well, Adam. So yeah, it's been fun.
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Robert. This is great.
No, always a pleasure. So for those who tuned in live, hope you enjoyed this. And for those who will watch it in the future after the live stream, I hope it will be informative. So yeah, thank you for everyone who tuned in today. Yeah, the live stream's over.